Hey everyone, welcome back to all our loyal subscribers and a warm welcome to those of you who are tuning in for the first time. If you're new here, you found the perfect place for those sleepless nights filled with spine-chilling stories. But before the fear kicks in, take a second to drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how far our spooky community reaches. Who knows, maybe one day we'll have fans from every corner of the world. Tonight, we're diving deep into a collection of terrifying stories. Before we jump in, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a chance to be the first to hear a new chilling tale. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. We've got stories lined up that will make you question every creak and shadow in your own home. And for those of you brave enough, hit that notification bell so you can join the premiere of each terrifying story as soon as it drops. Now let's begin. But be warned, once you start listening, these stories have a way of staying with you long after the video ends. Ready? Let's dive into the first chilling tale. I had been longing for a break from the city, a proper escape where I could leave behind the relentless noise, crowds, and the general busyness of urban life. The chance to rent a quaint, old house deep in the countryside was the perfect opportunity. When I first found the listing online, it seemed almost too good to be true. The photos showed a charming, ivy-covered house tucked away from the world, nestled among rolling fields. It looked like something out of a fairy tale. The rent was affordable, and I wasted no time in making the arrangements. When I finally arrived, the house didn't disappoint. It was just as picturesque as the photos suggested, if not more so. Ivy twisted along the weathered stone walls, and the garden was a riot of color, filled with blooming flowers that swayed gently in the breeze. The moment I stepped inside, I felt the coolness of the wooden floors beneath my feet, and a sense of serenity washed over me. This was exactly what I needed, a place where I could finally breathe, relax, and reset. The first few days were everything I had hoped for. The peacefulness of the countryside was like a balm to my soul. Each morning, I woke to the soft chirping of birds and the gentle light of the sun streaming through the large, open windows. I spent my days wandering through the surrounding fields, reading on the porch, and taking long, peaceful walks. Evenings were filled with the warmth of a good book and the crackling fire, as the cool breeze drifted in from the open windows. But as the days passed, I started to feel an odd sense of unease. It was subtle at first, a strange sensation that I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was as though there was something off about the house, something I hadn't noticed before. At night, when the house settled and the wind blew softly outside, I felt as though I wasn't truly alone. It wasn't that I saw anything or heard anything out of the ordinary. It was more of a presence, something I could sense in the stillness. This feeling became impossible to ignore when, while organizing some of my things in the basement, I stumbled upon a small door hidden in the shadows. The basement itself was nothing special, just an unfinished space with concrete walls and a faint, musty smell. I had been storing some boxes down there, and as I moved them aside, I saw a door I hadn't noticed before. It was small, barely taller than 4 feet, and tucked into the farthest corner, almost as if someone had deliberately hidden it away. The door was old, its heavy wooden surface chipped and weathered with age. A brass handle, worn smooth by years of use, glinted faintly in the dim light of the basement's single, bare bulb. At first, I didn't think much of it. I assumed it was probably just a storage closet, maybe where the previous tenant had left some old junk. But something about the door intrigued me. It felt out of place in an otherwise ordinary basement. I reached for the handle and tried to turn it, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. That should have been the end of it. A locked door in the basement of a house I was renting. It wasn't my business to open it. Yet, as I stood there staring at the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something behind it, something that was waiting to be discovered. My curiosity started to gnaw at me, becoming stronger with each passing day. The next morning, I decided to ask the landlord about the door. "Oh, that room's off limits," he said curtly when I brought it up. His tone was sharp, almost offensive. "It's not part of the rental agreement. Just leave it alone." There was no further explanation, no offer of information about what was inside. His abruptness only made me more suspicious. Why was the room locked? What was so important in there that it couldn't even be mentioned in the agreement? From that moment on, the door occupied my thoughts. Every time I went down to the basement, my eyes would drift toward it. I would stand there for what felt like hours, staring at the door, imagining what could be on the other side. Was it just storage? Or was there something more, something hidden? Days turned into weeks, and my curiosity turned into obsession. I knew I had no reason to go into that room, but I couldn't help myself. The house, once a peaceful retreat, now felt charged with a strange energy that seemed to pulse around that locked door. Then one evening, something happened that changed everything. I had just finished dinner and was cleaning up the kitchen when I found a small, brass key tucked away in the very back of one of the kitchen drawers. The moment I saw it, my heart skipped a beat. I knew instantly that this was the key to the locked door. It had to be. The key was old, its surface smooth from years of use, but it was well preserved, almost too well preserved. It looked as though someone had hidden it there on purpose, like they didn't want it to be found easily. But now that I had it in my hand, I knew what I had to do. My heart raced as I made my way down to the basement, the key clutched tightly in my palm. I could feel the weight of it, heavy with the promise of uncovering the house's secret. As I approached the door, the air around me seemed to grow colder, more still, as if the house itself was holding its breath in anticipation. I hesitated for a moment, standing in front of the door, the key in my hand. Part of me knew I should leave it alone. The landlord had been clear. This room wasn't part of the deal, but the pull was too strong. I had to know what was inside. With trembling fingers, I slid the key into the lock. There was a soft click, and the door creaked open. The room beyond was a stark contrast to the rest of the dusty, unfinished basement. It was pristine, like a time capsule sealed off from the world for decades. The air inside was cool and still, almost unnaturally so, and the room was eerily clean, no dust, no cobwebs, nothing. A small table stood in the center, with a single chair tucked beneath it. Shelves lined the walls, filled with old books and trinkets. But what caught my attention most were the photographs. There were hundreds of them, scattered across the room on the walls, the shelves, even on the floor, all in black and white, all meticulously framed and arranged in neat rows. And they were all of me. A shiver ran down my spine as I stepped closer to the photographs, my breath catching in my throat. The images were of me in various moments, walking in the garden, sitting on the porch, reading in the living room. Some were recent, from the past few weeks, while others looked like they had been taken the day I arrived. Who had taken these? How had I not noticed someone watching me? The more I looked, the more unsettled I became. Some of the photographs were taken from far away, but others were disturbingly close. There was one of me sitting at the kitchen table, taken from an angle that suggested the photographer had been in the room with me. There were even photos of me asleep in my bed, the sheets twisted around my body, my face relaxed in the peacefulness of slumber. My stomach churned, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. Someone had been in my house, had been watching me, photographing me, without my knowledge. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I stumbled backward, my heart racing in my chest. I couldn't bear it any longer. I backed out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking as I locked it and hurried back upstairs, the key heavy in my pocket. I shoved it back into the drawer where I had found it, as if returning it to its hiding place could somehow erase what I had seen. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside set my nerves on edge. I kept expecting to hear footsteps in the hallway, the sound of someone sneaking through the house. But the night passed in silence, the house as still as ever. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a mistake, a misunderstanding. Perhaps the photos had been left by a previous tenant, someone with an unusual hobby. Maybe the landlord didn't even know about them. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. When I finally worked up the courage to return to the basement, the door to the locked room was just as I had left it. I stood there for a long moment, my hand on the key, debating whether or not to go back inside. Part of me wanted to leave it alone, to pretend I had never found it, but I had to know. I opened the door, and my breath caught in my throat. The room was exactly the same, except for one horrifying detail. The photographs had been replaced. The new ones were in color, the images sharp and clear, and they were all of me asleep in my bed. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked at the photos, each one taken from a different angle, as if someone had been standing right next to me, while I slept. The sheets were the same, the position of my body identical to how I remembered lying the night before. The realization hit me like a cold wave. Someone had been in my room while I slept. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the threshold as I fled the room. The key slipped from my fingers, clattering to the floor, but I didn't care. I bolted up the stairs, my mind racing with fear. Within the hour, I had packed my things and was in my car, speeding away from the house as fast as I could. I didn't tell the landlord why I was leaving early. I didn't even bother to ask for a refund. All I knew was that I couldn't stay there another night. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the window, watching me leave. But the house remained still and silent, its secrets hidden behind its quaint exterior. I never found out who took those photos or why they were there, but the memory of that room and the feeling of being watched stayed with me long after I left. I learned a valuable lesson that summer. Some doors are better left locked. Story 2. The notes on my desk. At work, everything had become routine. I had been with the company for a few years, and each day followed the same predictable rhythm. My desk, nestled in a quiet corner of the office, had become a second home, complete with photos of my family and a few potted plants to brighten up the sterile workspace. There was never any reason to feel uneasy, not in a place as mundane as an office. At least, that's what I thought until the notes started appearing. It was a typical Monday morning. I arrived at my desk, set down my coffee, and began preparing for the day ahead. As I reached into my drawer to grab a pen, I noticed a small, folded piece of paper sitting neatly on top of my notepad. My name was scrawled on the front in a handwriting I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it was a joke, maybe a leftover note from a team building exercise we'd done a few weeks ago that I had forgotten about. But as I unfolded the paper, the words inside sent a chill down my spine. I know what you did last summer. The message was brief but unsettling. My mind raced. What could this mean? I hadn't done anything noteworthy last summer, certainly nothing secretive or scandalous. It had been a normal vacation with a few close friends, nothing more. I laughed it off, assuming it was some kind of prank from one of my coworkers with a strange sense of humor. I crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash, determined not to let it ruin my morning. But the nagging feeling of discomfort lingered. The next few days passed uneventfully, and I began to forget about the strange note. But then, another one appeared. This time, it was tucked under my keyboard, the same neat handwriting, the same eerie sense of familiarity. I'm closer than you think. The note was even more cryptic than the last, and this time I couldn't dismiss it as a harmless prank. Whoever was leaving these messages knew something about me, something personal. My heart raced as I scanned the office, trying to catch a glimpse of anyone watching me or sneaking glances in my direction, but everything seemed perfectly normal. People went about their business, oblivious to the growing unease gnawing at me. I confided in my friend Sarah, who worked in the office next to mine. It's probably just someone messing with you, she said, trying to reassure me. Maybe they're bored. Offices can be pretty dull, after all. Her words didn't comfort me. Something about the notes felt off, too personal, too calculated. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was writing them knew me on a deeper level than just a casual coworker. Days passed and the notes kept coming. Each one was more invasive, more personal than the last. The messages contained details about my life, things no one else should know. My childhood fears, my anxieties, even things I had never spoken aloud to anyone. Every time I opened a drawer or moved a stack of papers, there was another note waiting for me, each one signed with the same neat, slanted handwriting. I began to grow paranoid. I started looking around the office with suspicion, trying to catch anyone who might be watching me or acting out of the ordinary, but nothing ever seemed amiss. My coworkers were the same as always, laughing, chatting, engrossed in their work. No one seemed to be paying any special attention to me, and that only made the situation more disturbing. After the third note appeared, I decided it was time to talk to HR. Mrs. Dempsey, the HR manager, was a stern woman who had been with the company for as long as anyone could remember. She listened to my concerns with a stony expression, her sharp eyes narrowing as I explained the situation. "We'll look into it," she said curtly. "Do you have any idea who might be responsible?" I shook my head, feeling a bit foolish for even bringing it up. It seemed absurd, a grown adult complaining about mysterious notes at work, but there was something about the way the notes were written, the intimate details they contained, that unnerved me to my core. Mrs. Dempsey assured me they would review the security footage and keep an eye out for anything suspicious. For a few days, I felt a small sense of relief, hoping that maybe HR would quietly handle the situation and the notes would stop. But they didn't. If anything, the notes got worse. The next one I found was tucked inside my desk drawer, placed so neatly that I almost missed it. The message was simple, but it sent a jolt of fear through me. "I'm watching you right now, Dot." I froze, my hand trembling as I clutched the note. The room around me felt suddenly suffocating, the air thick with tension. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I slowly turned around, half expecting to find someone standing there, watching me. But the office was empty. It was late in the afternoon, and most of my coworkers had already left for the day. The usual hum of conversations and ringing phones had faded into an eerie silence. The lights overhead flickered slightly, casting long shadows across the cubicles. I stood up, my legs shaky, and walked around my desk, scanning every corner of the office. I checked behind partitions, peered into empty conference rooms, even looked out the window into the darkened parking lot below. There was no one. But the feeling of being watched lingered. It gnawed at me, a constant presence in the back of my mind, even when I was alone. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things and left the office in a hurry, not bothering to say goodbye to anyone. The whole way home, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me, but the streets were empty. That weekend, I barely slept. Every creak in my apartment, every rustle of the wind outside, set my nerves on edge. I kept expecting to find another note slipped under my door or taped to my window, but none came. For 2 days, I lived in a state of constant fear, unable to relax, unable to think about anything other than the notes. When Monday rolled around, I dreaded going back to work. I arrived at my desk, bracing myself for what I might find, but there was nothing. No note. No sign that anything had been disturbed. For a brief moment, I felt a surge of relief. Maybe it was over. Maybe HR had quietly dealt with the issue, and the notes had finally stopped. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The note I had found on Friday, the one that said, "I'm watching you right now," was gone. I had left it in my drawer, but now it was missing. Someone had taken it. Panic surged through me as I frantically searched my desk, but the note was nowhere to be found. Whoever had been leaving the notes had come back, and they had taken the last one, the one that had terrified me the most. I went straight to HR, demanding answers. Mrs. Dempsey was less than sympathetic. "We've reviewed the security footage," she said coldly. "No one has been tampering with your desk. Are you sure you didn't misplace the notes yourself?" Her words stung, but they only fueled my paranoia. I knew I hadn't misplaced the note. Someone had taken it. Someone who knew far too much about me. For the next few weeks, the note stopped, but the fear didn't. Every day, I arrived at my desk, bracing myself for the possibility of another message. I couldn't concentrate at work anymore, always looking over my shoulder, always waiting for something to happen. My productivity plummeted, and I became withdrawn, isolating myself from my coworkers. I no longer trusted anyone. Eventually, the paranoia became too much. I quit my job, citing personal reasons. I couldn't bear the thought of spending another day in that office, wondering who had been watching me, who had been leaving those notes. Even after I left, the fear lingered. I never found out who was behind the notes or how they knew so much about me, but the experience left a scar, a lingering sense of unease that I could never quite shake. Even now, sometimes I find myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me from the shadows. Story 3. The alarm that kept going off every night. I had just moved into the house, a charming old place in a quiet neighborhood. It was the kind of home that felt inviting, with its antique fixtures, wide windows, and cozy lived-in feel. The previous owner assured me that everything was in working order, and I didn't doubt him. Everything seemed perfect, a fresh start in a new town. At least that's how it felt during the day. The first time the alarm went off, I dismissed it as a glitch. It was late, close to 3 in the morning, and the shrill sound jolted me awake, my heart racing from the sudden noise. Groggy and disoriented, I shuffled downstairs to disarm the system. The house was silent, except for the insistent blaring of the alarm, which seemed to cut through the stillness like a knife. I punched in the code and turned it off, breathing a sigh of relief as the noise ceased. I checked the windows and doors, making sure they were all locked and secure. Nothing seemed out of place. It must have been a technical error, I thought to myself, something to do with the alarm system's age. The house was old, after all, and perhaps the alarm was simply showing signs of wear and tear. I went back to bed, convinced that it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in the pit of my stomach. Still, I managed to fall asleep eventually. The next night, the alarm went off again at exactly the same time, 2:47 a.m. This time, I was less sleepy, my senses heightened by the eerie repetition of the event. Once again, I disarmed the system, checked the windows, and found nothing wrong. But the fact that it had happened twice in a row at the exact same time made me nervous. I called the alarm company the next morning, explaining the situation. They sent a technician out later that day. The man was friendly enough, but as he ran diagnostics on the system, he found nothing wrong. No signs of tampering, no malfunctions. He reset the alarm, assured me that everything was working fine, and left me with a smile. That night, it happened again. 2:47 a.m. The alarm blared through the house, waking me from a deep sleep. This time, my heart was pounding and a cold sweat broke out across my skin as I scrambled to disarm the system. I could feel the fear creeping up my spine as I checked the doors and windows for the third night in a row. Nothing. Everything was secure. No broken locks, no signs of forced entry. What was going on? I was starting to feel unsettled. The technician had said everything was fine, so why did the alarm keep going off? Why always at the same time? The fourth night, I decided to stay awake. I wanted to see if I could catch whatever was triggering the alarm. I brewed a pot of coffee and sat in the living room, the glow of the streetlights filtering in through the curtains. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that seemed unnatural, even though nothing was out of place. As the clock ticked closer to 2:47 a.m., my anxiety grew. I sat there, waiting, listening to the steady tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hallway. My eyes darted around the room, scanning for anything out of the ordinary, but there was nothing. Then, at exactly 2:47 a.m., the alarm blared to life again. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat as the piercing sound filled the house. My fingers fumbled with the keypad as I disarmed it, my nerves shot from the sudden shock. As I stood there, trembling, something else happened, something I hadn't noticed before. There were footsteps. Sir. Soft, deliberate footsteps echoing from upstairs. I froze, my blood turning to ice. I strained to listen, but there was no mistaking it, the sound of someone moving slowly, carefully across the floorboards above me. Panic surged through me. I wasn't alone. The first thing I did was grab my phone. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911, whispering to the operator that someone was in my house. She stayed calm, telling me to lock myself in a room and wait for the police, but I could barely think straight. My mind was racing, my heart pounding in my ears. I could still hear the footsteps, slow and measured, as if whoever was upstairs knew exactly where they were going. I locked myself in the bathroom, crouching down in the corner with my phone clutched tightly in my hand. The minutes dragged by like hours as I waited for the sound of sirens. I held my breath, praying that whoever was upstairs wouldn't come down to the basement. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. Doors slammed and voices called out, announcing the arrival of the police. But the footsteps upstairs never stopped. Even as the police entered the house, calling out my name and searching the rooms, the sound of footsteps continued steady, unhurried. as if whoever was upstairs was completely undisturbed by the presence of the authorities. When I finally emerged from the bathroom, the officers were already sweeping through the house. I was shaking, adrenaline coursing through my veins as I explained what had happened, the alarm, the footsteps, everything. But when they finished searching, they found nothing. There were no signs of forced entry, no intruder, no one upstairs. The officers checked the windows and doors again, making sure everything was secure. They even reviewed the security footage from the cameras I had installed around the house after the first few incidents, but the footage showed nothing. No one entering or leaving, no shadowy figures creeping through the halls, nothing. It was as if the footsteps were all in my head, but I knew what I had heard. I wasn't imagining it. There had been someone or something moving around upstairs, and the thought of it sent chills down my spine. The officers tried to reassure me, suggesting that perhaps it was just the house settling, or maybe an animal outside that I had mistaken for an intruder, but I wasn't convinced. The sound of those footsteps had been too deliberate, too human. Something wasn't right, and I could feel it in my gut. After the police left, I spent the rest of the night in a state of restless anxiety. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. The alarm went off again the next night, 2:47 a.m., right on schedule. This time, I didn't even bother checking the doors and windows. I knew they were locked. I just sat there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of footsteps above me. They moved slowly, methodically, as if whoever or whatever was up there knew I was listening. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. Every night, the same thing. The alarm, the footsteps, the police finding nothing. It was driving me to the brink of madness. Desperate for answers, I called the alarm company again. They sent another technician who ran more tests on the system. He found nothing wrong. No malfunctions, no glitches. As far as the system was concerned, everything was working perfectly. That night, the alarm went off again. 2:47 a.m. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag and left the house, staying with a friend while I tried to figure out what to do next. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly on edge, terrified of what might happen every night at 2:47 a.m. I called in another round of police, but again they found nothing. The alarm continued to malfunction. The footsteps continued to echo in the recordings, and I knew that whatever was happening in that house, it wasn't going to stop. Then, one final night, something changed. The alarm went off as usual at 2:47 a.m., but this time, when I listened to the security footage, the footsteps were louder, clearer, as if whoever or whatever was in the house was no longer trying to hide. And then I heard something else. A voice, faint but unmistakable. A low, guttural whisper, like someone speaking just below the threshold of hearing. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound of it sent a wave of terror through me. I knew in that moment that I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I fled in the middle of the night, leaving everything behind. I didn't care about the alarm anymore. I didn't care about the footsteps. I just needed to get out. As I drove away from the house, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone standing in the window, watching me go. But the house remained still and silent, its secrets hidden behind its quaint exterior. I never went back. I never found out what was triggering the alarm, or who or what was walking through the house at 2:47 a.m. every night. All I know is that I'm never going back to that house. Story 4. My stolen wallet was returned, but it came with a terrifying message. It was a night like any other. My friends and I had gone out for dinner at our favorite restaurant, followed by drinks at a local bar. The evening was filled with laughter, stories, and the kind of easy camaraderie that made time slip away unnoticed. It was one of those perfect nights that left you smiling long after it was over. The next morning, however, that happiness was shattered the moment I reached for my wallet and found it missing. At first, I thought I had simply misplaced it. My apartment wasn't big, and I retraced my steps carefully, checking every corner, every pocket, and even calling the restaurant and bar in case someone had found it and turned it in. But it was nowhere to be found. The sinking realization hit me slowly, My wallet wasn't lost, it had been stolen. The thought was jarring. My entire evening had felt so carefree, but now I was dealing with the harsh reality of a thief having access to my personal information. I canceled my credit cards, filed a police report, and began the tedious process of replacing my driver's license and other important documents. It was a hassle, but nothing more than an inconvenience, or so I thought. What really bothered me was the idea that someone out there had my wallet, had access to my name, my address, and could be using it for who knows what purpose. It made me feel vulnerable in a way I hadn't anticipated. A few days passed, and I was beginning to move on from the incident. It was annoying, but nothing that couldn't be fixed with time. Then, one morning, everything changed. I was heading out for work when I noticed something strange. A plain white envelope slipped under my front door. It was unmarked with no return address, but my name was scrawled across the front in messy handwriting that I didn't recognize. Puzzled, I bent down and picked it up. I could feel something inside. Something solid, small. My pulse quickened as I tore open the envelope, and inside there was my wallet. For a brief moment, relief washed over me. Someone had found my wallet and returned it. Maybe the thief had felt guilty, or perhaps someone had picked it up after it had been discarded. Either way, I had my wallet back and I felt a small surge of hope. But when I opened it, my stomach dropped. The wallet had been emptied of all its contents. My credit cards, my ID, my cash, everything was gone. The only thing left inside was a single slip of paper tucked neatly into one of the card slots. My hands trembled as I pulled it out, and my heart skipped a beat as I read the message written in large, bold letters. I know where you live, Dot. A cold shiver ran down my spine. My hand shook as I held the note, the words simple but filled with a menacing certainty that made my blood run cold. Someone had gone through the trouble of stealing my wallet, removing all its contents, and then returning it to me with this chilling message. Whoever it was, they knew where I lived. They had been to my home, close enough to slip the envelope under my door without me noticing. Fear gripped me as I stared at the note. My mind raced with questions. Who had done this? Why would they return the wallet? What did they want? I quickly checked the locks on my door, making sure everything was secure. Then, I pulled out my phone and called the police. They came quickly, took my statement, and examined the note, but there was little they could do. The note was vague, the threat implied but not overt. Without any further evidence, it was hard for them to act. I asked them to patrol the area more frequently, and they agreed. But the officer who spoke to me didn't seem convinced that it was anything more than a harmless prank. To me, however, it felt anything but harmless. The days that followed were a blur of paranoia and anxiety. Every time I heard a creak in my apartment or saw someone walking down the street, I felt a jolt of fear. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. I barely slept, jumping at every little sound, convinced that someone was trying to break in. The nights were the worst. The silence that once felt peaceful now felt oppressive, suffocating. I kept my curtains drawn, my doors locked, and my phone by my side at all times. I knew I needed to take action. The first thing I did was change the locks on my door. The thought that someone might have a key to my apartment filled me with dread, so I had a locksmith come out immediately. I watched as he installed the new locks, double-checking to make sure everything was secure. But even that didn't fully ease my fears. Next, I moved some of my belongings to a friend's place. I didn't have the time or resources to relocate entirely, but I thought that if I could make it look like I wasn't staying there full-time, it might deter whoever was watching me. I packed up some clothes, important documents, and anything of value, and spent a few nights crashing on my friend's couch. But the fear followed me. No matter where I went, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. Even when I was away from home, I kept expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to pounce. The next step was installing a security system. I bought cameras, motion detectors, and alarms, anything that could give me a sense of control. The security company assured me that my apartment was now one of the safest in the city, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every time I entered my apartment, I checked the footage from the cameras, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever had left that note, but nothing ever showed up. It was as if the person had simply vanished. leaving me in a state of perpetual dread. The days turned into weeks, and gradually the intensity of my fear began to subside. Though it never completely disappeared, I started to regain some sense of normalcy. I returned to my daily routine, but I remained hyper-vigilant. I avoided going out late at night, kept my curtains drawn, and checked the locks multiple times before going to bed. But the memory of that note haunted me. It was a constant reminder that someone out there had invaded my life in the most personal way possible. Someone had stolen my wallet, emptied its contents, and then returned it to me with a threat. It wasn't just the act itself that disturbed me, it was the message behind it. The note wasn't a robbery, it was a statement, a reminder that I was vulnerable, that my sense of security could be shattered by a single anonymous act. I became obsessed with trying to figure out who had done it. I went over every detail of that night out with friends, trying to remember if anyone had been acting strangely or if I had seen anyone following me, but nothing stood out. I even considered the possibility that it was some kind of sick joke. Maybe someone I knew had found my wallet and thought it would be funny to scare me, but the note didn't feel like a prank. It felt like a threat, one that I couldn't ignore. Months passed, and while the fear no longer consumed me, it had left its mark. I was more cautious, more aware of my surroundings, and less trusting of others. The feeling of being watched never completely left me, lurking in the back of my mind like a shadow. I knew I had to move on, but part of me would always be looking over my shoulder, wondering if that anonymous threat would ever come to pass. In the end, I never found out who took my wallet or why they returned it with that ominous note. The mystery remained unsolved, a lingering question with no answer. But the experience changed me. It made me realize how vulnerable we can be, how easily our sense of security can be shattered by a single anonymous act. And it taught me to be more careful to never take my safety for granted, because once you've been marked, the fear of what might happen next never truly goes away. Story 5. The text from an unknown number. It started on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. I was sitting at my desk finishing up some emails when my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen and saw a message from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, thinking it was another spam message, but something made me pause. I opened it, expecting the usual nonsense, but what I read made my skin crawl. "Nice blue shirt today. You look good in that color dot." My heart skipped a beat as I looked down at my shirt. It was blue. A simple button-down, nothing special. But how did this person know what I was wearing? I glanced around the office, scanning the faces of my coworkers, but no one seemed to be paying any attention to me. Everyone was engrossed in their work. I tried to brush it off as a coincidence, but the message left a strange, uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. How could a random number know what I was wearing? I didn't respond. Instead, I went back to work, trying to focus on the tasks in front of me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The next morning, my phone buzzed again. "Did you enjoy your coffee at the corner cafe? The barista gave you an extra shot, didn't she?" My blood ran cold. I had, in fact, stopped at the cafe that morning. I had chatted briefly with the barista, who had added an extra shot of espresso to my drink as a friendly gesture, but I hadn't told anyone about it. I hadn't posted it on social media. How could this person possibly know? Panic bubbled up inside me as I stared at the text. I looked around the office again, half expecting to see someone smirking at me from across the room. But once again, everyone seemed to be going about their business as usual. Was someone following me? How could they know such specific details about my day? The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. I didn't have enemies, I was just an ordinary person living an ordinary life. Why would anyone be targeting me? I still didn't respond to the message, but my anxiety was growing. I kept my phone close by, constantly checking for new messages. I couldn't concentrate on work. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would race, and the text didn't stop. Over the next few days, more messages came in, each one more personal, more invasive than the last. They detailed my routines, the places I had been, and even conversations I had had. One afternoon, I received a text that said, "You dropped your keys outside your apartment this morning. Careful next time, you might lose them. I had indeed dropped my keys earlier that day, fumbling with my bag as I left for work, but I hadn't seen anyone around. No one was close enough to have noticed. I glanced out of my office window, a sinking feeling in my stomach. Was someone watching me right now? By this point, I was completely unnerved. Every aspect of my life seemed to be under surveillance. The messages were too accurate to be random, too specific to be a prank. Whoever was sending these texts knew things about me that they shouldn't. I started to grow paranoid. Every time I left the house, I felt like I was being followed. I began to take different routes to work, hoping to shake off whoever was watching me. I stopped going to my favorite coffee shops, avoiding places I frequented, but no matter where I went, the texts followed. Nice detour today, but I still see you, Dot. That message sent a chill down my spine. I had taken a completely different route to work that day, intentionally avoiding the usual streets. How had they known? How were they always one step ahead of me? I confided in my friend Kate, hoping she could offer some insight. We were sitting at a coffee shop, the bustling sounds of the city around us providing a stark contrast to the eerie silence I had grown used to from the texts. "That's really creepy," Kate said, her eyes wide with concern. "Have you thought about changing your number?" I nodded. "I have, but part of me doesn't want to. I feel like I need to know who's doing this. It's getting under my skin." Kate frowned. "You should be careful. It could be some kind of prank, but it could also be something more serious." I knew she was right. Something about the texts felt too deliberate, too invasive to be a simple prank, but I wasn't sure what to do. I couldn't just ignore the texts, not when they were beginning to feel so personal, so threatening. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, phone in hand, waiting for the inevitable buzz of a new message. The clock ticked past midnight, and just as I was about to give up and go to sleep, my phone lit up. I hesitated for a moment before opening the text. "Be careful on your way out tomorrow. You might trip on the last step, Dot." A chill ran down my spine as I read the words. The last step of the staircase leading out of my building had always been a bit tricky. I had nearly tripped on it before, but never actually fallen. Was this person predicting that I would trip, or was it a threat? The next morning, I was extra careful as I descended the stairs. I hovered over the last step, my heart pounding in my chest, but in my hesitation, I lost my balance. I stumbled, barely catching myself on the banister. My heart raced as I stood at the bottom of the stairs, the words of the text echoing in my mind. How could they have known? The texts had shifted. They weren't just observations anymore, they were predictions. Whoever was sending them seemed to know what would happen to me before it even occurred. I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I called the police, explaining the situation. They listened politely, but without a concrete threat, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested I change my number, but I was hesitant. Changing my number wouldn't stop whoever was watching me. It wouldn't give me the answers I so desperately wanted. I tried tracing the number, but every attempt led to a dead end. It was as if the number didn't exist, a ghost in the system. The police couldn't trace it either. Whoever was doing this had covered their tracks well. The texts continued, each one more unsettling than the last. They predicted minor accidents, small misfortunes, none of them life-threatening, but all of them disturbingly accurate. "Watch out for that puddle tomorrow. You don't want to get your shoes wet, Dot." The next day, it rained and I nearly stepped into a puddle just outside my office. The text had been right. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. How could someone know so much about my life? How could they predict things with such precision? It wasn't just chance, it couldn't be. Whoever was doing this had access to my life in a way that defied explanation. I began withdrawing from my usual routines, hoping to throw off whoever was watching me. I changed my commute, stopped going to my favorite spots, even started taking different routes home, but the texts followed me, taunting me with their accuracy. "Nice try with the detour, but I'm still here, Dot." Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would race. I dreaded what I might read next, but I couldn't stop myself from looking. Then, just as abruptly as they had started, the text stopped. At first, I felt a sense of relief. I hadn't received a message in over 24 hours, and I began to hope that maybe finally it was over. Maybe whoever was watching me had lost interest, moved on to someone else. But the relief was short-lived, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. Why had they stopped? Had they moved on? Or was this part of some larger plan? The days turned into weeks and still there were no more texts. I tried to return to my normal life, but the memory of those weeks of torment lingered. The silence, however, was almost worse than the texts themselves. I found myself constantly on edge, waiting for the next message, the next sign that someone was still watching. But nothing came. I should have felt relieved, but instead I felt a creeping dread. Whoever had been sending the text wasn't done with me, yet I could feel it. They had known too much, been too precise to simply disappear without a trace. And then, one night months later, as I was sitting alone in my apartment, my phone buzzed. My heart stopped. I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. The message was from an unknown number, but this time it wasn't the same one as before. The text was short, just 2 words. Missed me? Story 6. The Silent Neighbor Who Knew Too Much. When I first moved into my new apartment, I barely noticed the man who lived next door. He was quiet, always keeping to himself, and never caused any trouble. In fact, I didn't even know his name for the first few months. It was the kind of building where people minded their own business. Everyone passed each other in the hallways with a polite nod, but rarely stopped to chat. And honestly, I was fine with that. I had just moved to the city for a fresh start, and the last thing I needed was nosy neighbors prying into my life. But over time, I began to notice things small, unsettling things about the man next door. He was always home. No matter what time I left for work in the morning, or how late I came back at night, his blinds were always drawn, and I could sometimes see a faint glow of light coming from his windows. His car was always parked in the same spot, and I never saw him leave the building. At first, I thought he might work from home. It wasn't unusual, especially in the city, where more and more people were telecommuting. But there was something about his constant presence that started to make me uneasy. How could someone live so close, and yet be so invisible? I shrugged it off. After all, it wasn't any of my business. Maybe he was just a private person who enjoyed his solitude. But the more I noticed him, the more I started to feel like I was being watched. It was subtle at first, a fleeting sensation of someone's eyes on me as I left my apartment, or an inexplicable shiver as I passed his door. I told myself I was being paranoid. I had always been a bit jumpy, especially since moving to a new city where everything felt unfamiliar. But then things started happening that I couldn't explain. It began with small things going missing, items I couldn't imagine misplacing, a pair of keys that I swore I had left on the kitchen counter, a letter from my mailbox that seemed to disappear without a trace. At first, I chalked it up to forgetfulness. I was adjusting to a new job, a new apartment, a new life. It was normal to be a little scatterbrained, right? Then came the knock on my door late one night. It was nearly midnight, and I had just settled into bed with a book when I heard it, 3 soft, deliberate knocks. Not the kind of knock you'd expect from a delivery person or a neighbor in need of sugar. It was calculated, too soft to be urgent, but loud enough to get my attention. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether I should answer, but something compelled me to get up. I wrapped my robe tightly around me and crept to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I peered through the peephole, but the hallway was empty. No one was there. I opened the door just a crack, scanning the corridor for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no shadows, no sound. Just an eerie stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As I was about to close the door, something caught my eye. There, on the floor just outside my apartment, was a small piece of paper. I bent down and picked it up, my fingers trembling slightly as I unfolded it. The note was short and simple, written in neat, precise handwriting. I see you, ... My blood ran cold. I slammed the door shut, my heart racing as I locked and bolted it. Who had left the note? And why? Was someone watching me? Had I been too careless, too visible in this new place where I thought no one knew me? The next morning, I was still rattled, but I convinced myself it had been a prank. Someone in the building must have thought it was funny to mess with the new tenant. I didn't want to let it get to me. I went about my day, trying to put it out of my mind. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Every time I left my apartment, I felt a pair of eyes on me. Every time I came home, I found myself rushing inside, locking the door behind me as if someone was just waiting for the moment I let my guard down. And the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't shake the suspicion that it was the man next door. I started noticing small things, how his door would creak open just a fraction of an inch whenever I passed by, how I could hear faint shuffling noises coming from his apartment late at night. Once, when I was coming home from work, I glanced over at his windows and saw the blinds move ever so slightly, as if someone had been peeking out and had quickly ducked out of sight. It was unnerving, but I tried to tell myself it was all in my head. I was stressed, adjusting to a new place. I couldn't jump to conclusions without proof. Then one day, everything changed. I came home after a long day at work, and as I approached my door, I noticed something strange. The lock didn't feel quite right. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but I had become so familiar with the click of my lock that I could sense something was off. I stepped inside cautiously, and immediately, I knew something was wrong. The air felt different, thicker, almost as if someone had been there recently. My eyes scanned the room, and at first, everything seemed to be in its place, but then I noticed a picture frame on my shelf, slightly tilted, as if it had been disturbed. My heart started pounding in my chest. I walked over to the shelf and straightened the frame, my hands trembling. That's when I saw it. I saw it. There, tucked behind the frame, was another note. This one was even more unsettling than the first. I'd been inside. I stumbled back, my mind racing. Someone had been in my apartment. Someone had gone through my things, had left a note for me to find, and whoever it was, they wanted me to know they could get in whenever they wanted. I called the police immediately. They arrived within minutes, but there was little they could do. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing had been taken. The officer who took my statement seemed sympathetic, but I could tell he didn't take it seriously. Maybe you forgot to lock the door, he suggested, but I knew I hadn't. I was always careful about locking up, especially after that first note. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to every creak, every sound, convinced that someone was lurking just outside my door. The next morning, I decided to confront the man next door. I had no proof, but I couldn't live in fear any longer. I needed answers. I knocked on his door, my heart racing as I waited for him to answer, but there was no response. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Finally, I tried the doorknob. To my surprise, it turned easily. The door wasn't locked. I hesitated for a moment, but something compelled me to push it open. The apartment was dark, the blinds drawn tightly shut. I stepped inside cautiously, calling out to see if anyone was there, but the place was eerily quiet. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I began to notice things small, disturbing things that made my stomach churn. The apartment was a mess, with papers and junk scattered everywhere, but what caught my attention were the walls. They were covered in photographs, hundreds of them, and every single one was of me. My blood ran cold as I scanned the room, recognizing my own face in every picture. Some were taken from inside my apartment, through the windows, and some were even closer, taken inside my home while I was sleeping, reading, cooking. I felt sick. My mind raced with terror as I realized the man next door had been watching me, studying me, invading my privacy in the most intimate way possible. That's when I heard it. A soft creak from the back of the apartment. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I turned toward the sound, my eyes straining to see in the darkness. There, standing in the doorway of a back room, was the man. His eyes were wide and unblinking, fixed on me with an intensity that sent a wave of terror through my body. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. I ran. I bolted out of his apartment, down the stairs, and out into the street, not stopping until I was far from the building. I didn't care about the police, didn't care about anything except getting away. I never went back to that apartment. I packed my things and moved to a new city, far away from that place and the man who had spent months watching me, learning about me, knowing things no one should know. I never found out what his intentions were, and I never wanted to. Some neighbors are better left unknown. Story 7. The Face in the Window. It was supposed to be the perfect place for me to unwind. I had just moved into a cozy cottage on the outskirts of town, a quiet, secluded home surrounded by trees, far from the chaos of city life. The rent was cheap, and the location was idyllic. It was exactly what I needed after months of stress and sleepless nights. A place where I could relax, recharge, and finally get some peace. The first week passed without incident. The air was crisp, the birds sang outside my window each morning, and the nights were calm and quiet. I would light a fire in the evenings, sit with a cup of tea, and watch the flames flicker as I lost myself in a good book. Life was peaceful. But that peace was shattered on the seventh night. It was late past midnight, and I was curled up on the couch, my book resting in my lap as I dozed off. The fire had died down and the room was dim, the only light coming from a small lamp on the side table. The world outside was pitch black, the thick trees surrounding the cottage blocking out any hint of moonlight. That's when I saw it. A face. A face. It was just for a split second, but I swear I saw a face staring at me through the window, pale, expressionless, and haunting. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I sat up, staring at the window, trying to see if my eyes had been playing tricks on me, but there was nothing there. Just the dark night and the faint reflection of the room behind me. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination. After all, I had been half asleep, lost in the haze of a good book. The brain can play tricks when it's tired, right? I forced myself to relax, convinced that it had just been a fleeting moment of drowsy paranoia. I went to bed that night, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept replaying that brief moment, the pale face in the window. Was it real? Or was it just my imagination? The next night, it happened again. I had just finished dinner and was sitting in the living room, watching TV. The room was dark except for the soft glow of the television screen, and the curtains were open, giving me a view of the night outside. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I turned toward the window, and there it was again, the same face, pressed against the glass, staring straight at me. This time I was sure it wasn't my imagination. My heart raced as I jumped up from the couch, rushing to the window to see if someone was outside. But by the time I reached it, the face was gone. I threw open the window and peered into the darkness, scanning the yard for any sign of an intruder. The only sound was the rustling of the leaves in the wind, and the night was as still as ever. But I knew what I had seen. Someone or something had been watching me. I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking each one before retreating to my bedroom. But even there, I didn't feel safe. I couldn't shake the image of the face from my mind the way it had appeared so suddenly, so silently, and then vanished without a trace. Who was out there? And why were they watching me? The next day, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it had been a prank, some local kids messing around, trying to scare the new tenant. Or maybe it was just a trick of the light, the way the trees outside cast shadows on the glass. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread gnawing at me. That night, I kept the curtains closed, determined not to give in to my fear. I tried to go about my evening as usual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak, every rustle of the wind outside made my heart jump. I kept glancing toward the window, half expecting to see the face again. And then, just as I was beginning to relax, it happened. I was standing in the kitchen, washing dishes, when I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. There, in the window above the sink, was the face, pale, lifeless, and pressed against the glass. This time, it didn't vanish. It stayed there, watching me. I gasped, stumbling backward, my breath catching in my throat. I grabbed a knife from the counter, my hand trembling as I slowly approached the window. But just as I reached it, the face was gone. I flung open the back door, rushing outside to catch whoever or whatever was there, but the yard was empty. There were no footprints in the dirt, no signs that anyone had been there at all. It was as if the face had never existed. I spent the rest of the night on edge, every sound sending my heart racing. I barely slept, my mind racing with fear and confusion. The next morning, I called the police. They arrived within the hour, and I explained everything: how I had seen the face in the window, how it had appeared night after night. The officer, a middle-aged man with a kind face, listened patiently, but I could tell he was skeptical. "Are you sure it wasn't just an animal?" he asked, glancing at the thick trees surrounding the cottage. "Sometimes raccoons or stray cats can get pretty close to the windows." I shook my head. It wasn't an animal, it was a person, or something that looked like a person. The officer nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He walked around the property, checking the windows and doors, but found nothing out of the ordinary. No footprints, no broken locks, nothing. "I'll have a patrol car swing by tonight, just to be safe," he said, but I knew he didn't really believe me. That night, I tried to stay calm. The police were going to keep an eye on the place, and I had locked all the doors and windows. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was watching me wasn't something the police could protect me from. I stayed up late, refusing to go to bed until I was sure everything was safe. But as the hours dragged on, exhaustion began to take its toll. I lay down on the couch, my eyes heavy, and eventually drifted off to sleep. I woke up with a start sometime around 2 a.m. The house was silent, the fire in the fireplace long dead. The only light came from the moon, casting eerie shadows through the curtains. And then I heard it, a soft tap on the window. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, but then it came again, another soft, deliberate tap. Slowly, I turned toward the window. The face was back. But this time, it wasn't just a face. There was a figure behind it, barely visible in the darkness. A tall, thin figure, standing just outside the window, watching me. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me with those empty, lifeless eyes. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. My voice was barely a whisper as I told the operator what was happening. "Stay on the line," she said, her voice calm and steady. "Officers are on their way." But before the police could arrive, the figure vanished just like before. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, swallowed by the darkness outside. When the police showed up, they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing. But I knew what I had seen. The face in the window wasn't just a trick of the light. It wasn't a prank, and it wasn't my imagination. Something or someone was watching me, and I had this sinking feeling that whatever it wasn't going to stop. Over the next few days, I tried to carry on with my life, but the face in the window haunted me. Every time I walked past the windows, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Every creak, every gust of wind made me jump. Then, one night, it happened for the last time. I had just gone to bed, hoping for a night of uninterrupted sleep. But around midnight, I woke up to the familiar feeling of being watched. I turned over, dreading what I knew I would see. There, standing outside my bedroom window, was the face. But this time, it was smiling. I screamed, scrambling out of bed and grabbing my phone. But before I could call the police, the figure disappeared into the night, leaving me trembling and alone. I never saw the face again after that night, but the memory of it has stayed with me, a constant reminder that sometimes the things that go bump in the night aren't just figments of our imagination. Sometimes they're real. Story 8. The call from my old phone number. It was a typical Wednesday afternoon, the kind where nothing remarkable happens. I was sitting at my desk halfway through a mountain of paperwork when my phone buzzed. Glancing at the screen, I froze. My heart skipped a beat as I saw the incoming call. It was from my old phone number. I stared at the screen for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. It was impossible. I had changed my number more than a year ago when I switched phone plans. I hadn't thought about my old number since. It wasn't even active anymore. So how was it calling me? Curiosity mixed with unease as I swiped to answer, my pulse quickening. I put the phone to my ear, half expecting some sort of technical glitch or prank. "Hello," I said, my voice hesitant. For a few seconds, there was nothing but silence on the other end. Then I heard something, a faint, crackling noise like static, and then a voice. "Hello?" The voice was mine. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't just someone mimicking my voice. It was my voice, the exact tone and inflection. The way I said the word hello, it was as if I was listening to a recording of myself. "Who is this?" I demanded, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. There was a long pause. Then the voice came again, quieter this time. "Who is this?" The same words, spoken in the same way, but now laced with confusion just like I had sounded. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. This had to be some sort of prank. Someone had to be messing with me. But how could anyone have gotten my old number? And how could they imitate my voice so perfectly? "Stop messing around," I said, my voice shaking. "Who are you?" Again, there was silence on the other end. I could hear faint breathing now, the same rhythm as my own. My skin prickled with unease as the breathing matched my own in perfect synchrony. Every breath I took, the person on the other end took one too, at exactly the same time. I hung up. My heart was racing, and my palms were clammy as I stared down at my phone. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. What had just happened? Was someone playing a sick joke, or had I imagined the whole thing? Before I could think about it too much, my phone buzzed again. I flinched, glancing at the screen. It was my old number calling me again. I didn't answer it this time. I let it ring until it stopped. Then, a few seconds later, it buzzed again, another call from the same number. I declined it, my hand trembling as I set the phone down, but it wouldn't stop. The phone kept buzzing, the same number flashing on the screen over and over again. I turned off my phone, hoping that would put an end to it, but the unease stayed with me. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. How could this be happening? How could someone be calling me from a number that no longer existed? That night, I tried to put the incident behind me, but the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. I knew I had to figure out what was going on. The next day, I went to the phone store where I had originally gotten the new number. I explained the situation to the clerk, a young guy with a bored expression who seemed more interested in his phone than in helping me. "Yeah, it's probably just a glitch," he said dismissively. "Maybe your old number got reassigned to someone else, and they're messing with you." That explanation made sense, but it didn't explain the voice. That voice had been mine, identical in every way, and the way it had spoken, the confusion, the fear, it mirrored my own feelings during the call. I pressed him further. "Is there any way to trace where the call came from? I mean, can we figure out who has the number now?" The clerk shrugged. "We don't usually have access to that kind of info. Numbers get recycled all the time. Could be anywhere." I left the store feeling more frustrated than ever. No one seemed to be taking this seriously, but I knew something wasn't right. My old number was calling me. And somehow my own voice was on the other end. That night I lay in bed, my phone on the nightstand, staring at the ceiling. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside made my nerves jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was trying to reach me. Just as I was about to drift off, my phone buzzed again. I sat up, heart racing, and looked at the screen. It was my old number. I didn't answer it. I couldn't. I just watched as it rang, the screen glowing in the darkness of my room. Then, to my horror, a notification popped up. One new voicemail dot. My stomach twisted with dread. I didn't want to listen to it, but something compelled me to. With shaking hands, I pressed play. At first, there was only static. I strained to hear anything through the crackling noise, but it was faint. Then, the static cleared, and I heard the voice. "Help M.E. dot." It was my voice again, but this time it sounded desperate, pleading. The words sent a chill down my spine. "Help me, please. Help M.E. dot." I dropped the phone, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of it all. How could this be happening? Was someone trying to scare me? Or was there something more sinister at play? For days, I tried to ignore the calls. I blocked the number, but somehow it kept getting through. Every night, like clockwork, my phone would buzz with calls from my old number. I stopped answering them, but the voicemails kept coming. Each one was worse than the last. At first, it was just my voice asking for help, but then the messages changed. They became darker, more disturbing. I could hear myself screaming, begging for something I couldn't understand. "Why are you doing this? Stop. Please, stop." The voice was mine, but it was filled with fear and pain emotions I hadn't experienced, at least not yet. I went back to the phone store, demanding answers. The clerk looked through the system but couldn't find any record of my old number being reassigned. It was as if it had vanished, no longer in use, but somehow still active. The calls kept coming. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think. Every time my phone buzzed, I felt a wave of panic wash over me. It was like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. One night, after another voicemail that left me shaking in terror, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I turned off my phone, shoved it in a drawer, and tried to forget about it. But the fear stayed with me. The feeling that something terrible was about to happen. A few days later, I was walking home from work, my mind still buzzing with the strange events of the past few weeks. I had turned a corner and was halfway down a quiet street when my phone buzzed. I had forgotten I had turned it back on earlier that morning. I pulled it out of my pocket and my heart sank. It was my old number calling again. This time I answered it. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I would finally get some answers. Maybe I was just tired of running from it. But as soon as I heard the voice on the other end, I knew I had made a mistake. "I'm you," the voice said, barely a whisper, "and I'm coming, Dot." The call ended abruptly, leaving me standing in the middle of the street, my breath catching in my throat. I never received another call from my old number after that night, but the message still haunts me. Because sometimes when I look in the mirror, I swear I can see something in my reflection that doesn't quite belong to me. Something that's waiting to take my place. Story 9. The strange sound coming from the attic. Description: what would you do if strange sounds started coming from your attic every night? In this chilling story, I thought it was just an old house creaking, but when the noises grew louder and more persistent, I decided to investigate. What I found up there was far worse than anything I could have imagined. Watch now to discover the terrifying truth hidden in the attic. I had lived in the house for almost 6 months before the noises began. It was a small old house, charming in a way that only old houses can be, with its creaky floorboards and vintage fixtures. Sure, it had its quirks, but I liked it. It had character. Or at least that's what I kept telling myself. The attic had been the one part of the house I'd never bothered with. When I moved in, the landlord had told me it was just a storage space, mostly filled with old junk left behind by previous tenants. I had no need for it, so I left it alone. The first time I heard the sound, I was in bed, drifting off to sleep. It was faint, barely audible, like a soft tapping. I figured it was just the wind or the house settling, common in a place as old as this one. But as the nights passed, the sound grew louder. It started to happen more frequently, usually around midnight. It was never anything dramatic, just a light thumping, like something moving around above me. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a squirrel, or a bird that had found its way into the attic. Still, the idea of something living up there unsettled me. I knew I should check it out, but I kept putting it off. There was always an excuse: work, exhaustion, or the simple fact that I didn't want to deal with whatever was up there. But one night, the sound changed. It was louder this time. Not just a soft thump or scurry, but a distinct dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the floor above me. The sound jolted me awake, and for a moment, I just lay there, staring up at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it. That was no animal. I sat up, my heart racing, listening to the strange noise. It didn't stop. It kept going slow, methodical, like someone or something was moving around up there. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. It was 2:47 a.m. The house was silent except for the eerie noise coming from the attic. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever was up there wasn't just going to go away. I had to investigate. With a deep breath, I climbed out of bed and grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand. My hands were shaking as I made my way toward the hallway, the sound of the dragging still echoing faintly above me. The attic hatch was in the hallway ceiling, a pull-down ladder that I had never bothered to use. I stood beneath it, staring up at the hatch, debating whether I should really do this. My mind raced with possibilities. What if there was someone up there? A squatter, maybe? Or something worse? But I couldn't let my fear paralyze me. I reached up, grabbed the cord, and pulled. The ladder creaked as it unfolded, and I winced at the sound. I shone my flashlight up into the opening, but all I could see was darkness. The strange noise had stopped. For a moment, I considered going back to bed, pretending I hadn't heard anything, but I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep if I didn't check it out. With a shaky breath, I climbed the ladder. The attic smelled musty, the air thick with dust and the scent of old wood. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the cluttered space. Just as the landlord had said, the attic was filled with old boxes and random junk, an old rocking chair, a few pieces of broken furniture, and piles of yellowed newspapers. But there was no sign of anyone or anything that could have made the noise. I took a step forward, the floor creaking under my weight. The attic was bigger than I had realized, with dark corners that my flashlight couldn't quite reach. I scanned the room, my pulse quickening as I strained to hear any sound. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the attic, just barely visible in the dim light, was a door. I frowned. I hadn't noticed it before. It was small, almost hidden behind a stack of boxes, and the paint was peeling, revealing old wood underneath. Curiosity mixed with fear as I slowly made my way toward it. The air felt colder here, heavier, as if something was waiting just behind that door. My hand shook as I reached for the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dark room. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. The room was bare, with nothing but a single chair sitting in the center. But then my flashlight caught something written on the wall. I stepped closer, squinting in the dim light. There, scrawled in what looked like black charcoal, were the words, "I'm still here." My breath caught in my throat. The words sent a wave of fear through me. I backed away, my heart racing, as my flashlight flickered. And then I heard it again. The dragging sound. But this time, it wasn't coming from the attic floor. It was coming from the walls. I froze, my body stiff with terror. The sound was louder now, more deliberate, as if something was moving just behind the wooden walls, scraping and dragging itself along the beams. I shone my flashlight toward the source of the noise, but there was nothing there, just the old, rotting wood of the attic. The sound grew louder, and I realized with horror that it was moving, getting closer. Whatever was making that noise, it was coming toward me. Panic surged through me. I backed away, stumbling over a pile of boxes, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to know what was behind those walls. I didn't want to see whatever was crawling toward me, but I could feel its presence, cold and menacing, closing in. I turned and bolted for the ladder, nearly tripping as I scrambled down the rungs. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the flashlight. The attic door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, and I raced back to my bedroom, slamming the door behind me. For the rest of the night, I sat in my bed, clutching the flashlight, listening for any sound, but the attic was silent. The next day, I called the landlord. I told him everything about the noises, the dragging, the writing on the wall, but he seemed unfazed. "That old house has a lot of history," he said. "Previous tenants always complained about the attic, said they heard strange things, but no one ever found anything." I pressed him for details, but he was frustratingly vague. He mentioned something about the house having once belonged to a family that had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, but he waved it off as an old urban legend. I didn't care about legends. I cared about the fact that something was in my attic, something that shouldn't have been there. I spent the next few nights in a state of constant fear. I could barely sleep, terrified that the noises would return, but the attic remained silent. And then, just when I thought I was safe, I found the note. It was on my kitchen table when I came home from work, a small slip of paper with the same scrawled handwriting I had seen in the attic. "I'm still here." I moved out the next day. I never went back to that house, and I never found out what was hiding in the attic. But sometimes, when I lie awake at night, I can still hear the sound of something dragging itself across the floor above me. And I know that wherever I go, it's still here. Story 10. The old doll that moved on its own. Description: what if you found an old doll that seemed innocent at first, only to realize it had a dark secret? In this chilling story, I discovered an old doll in the attic that seemed to move on its own. As the nights passed, strange things began to happen, leading me to a terrifying discovery. Watch now to uncover the horrifying truth behind the doll that was always watching. I hadn't expected to find anything when I first went up to the attic. It had been years since I moved into the house, and I hadn't bothered to explore every nook and cranny. The attic was just a dusty, forgotten space filled with old boxes and long abandoned items from previous owners. But one rainy afternoon, when I had nothing better to do, I decided to go up there and see what was left behind. The attic was like stepping into another time. The air was thick with dust, and the wooden beams creaked under my weight. I swept the beam of my flashlight over the stacks of old furniture, piles of newspapers, and forgotten relics. Everything was covered in a thick layer of grime, untouched for years. But then, tucked away in the far corner, I saw it. An old doll. It was sitting on top of a chest, as if waiting to be found. I almost missed it at first, its small body blending in with the shadows. But once I noticed it, I couldn't look away. The doll was old, very old. Its porcelain face was cracked and stained, the paint on its features worn away over time. Its eyes were large, dark, and glassy, giving it an unsettling, lifelike appearance. It wore a faded, tattered dress, once a bright blue but now dulled to a dingy gray. Its hair was matted and tangled, and its small, delicate hands were missing fingers. There was something about it that made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way it was positioned, sitting so perfectly upright on top of the chest. Or maybe it was those eyes, those dark, glassy eyes that seemed to follow me as I moved across the room. I knew I should have left it there. I had no reason to take the doll, but something about it drew me in. It felt wrong to just leave it sitting there, forgotten and abandoned. So I picked it up. The doll was surprisingly heavy for its size, its porcelain head cool to the touch. As I turned it over in my hands, I couldn't help but notice the craftsmanship. Despite its aging condition, it was a beautiful doll, intricately detailed and carefully made. Someone had once loved this doll, cared for it, but now it was just a relic of the past. I carried the doll downstairs and set it on the shelf in the living room. It was an odd decoration, sure, but I told myself it would be a conversation piece. And besides, I kind of liked the idea of giving the doll a second life after being forgotten in the attic for so long. That night, I went to bed as usual, the doll sitting silently on the shelf across the room. I didn't think much of it until I woke up. It was the middle of the night, and the house was deathly quiet. I lay there for a moment, trying to figure out what had woken me. My heart pounded in my chest as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. And then I saw it. The doll wasn't on the shelf anymore. It was sitting on the floor, right at the foot of my bed. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I stared at the doll, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. Had I knocked it off the shelf without realizing it? Had I moved it in my sleep? But no, there was no way it could have fallen that far. The shelf was across the room. The doll was sitting upright, its glassy eyes staring directly at me. He sat up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. My mouth was dry, and my hands were trembling as I reached for the doll. He picked it up, half expecting it to feel warm, as if it had been touched by someone or something, but it was just as cold as before. I told myself he must have been some kind of mistake. Maybe I had left it on the floor and forgotten. Maybe I'd knocked it over without realizing it. There had to be a logical explanation. I placed the doll back on the shelf and went back to bed. But I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the moment I had woken up to see it sitting there at the foot of my bed, those eyes staring at me in the darkness. The next day, I tried to shake off the unease. I went about my day as usual, convincing myself that it had all been a fluke, but as the day wore on, I couldn't stop thinking about the doll. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I glanced at the shelf where the doll sat. It was in the same spot, a glassy eyes staring straight ahead. I turned off the light and climbed into bed, determined not to let my imagination get the best of me. But in the middle of the night, I woke up again. This time, the doll wasn't at the foot of the bed. He was seating on my nightstand. I bolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. The doll was sitting there, just inches from my head, staring at me with those cold, lifeless eyes. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Had someone been in my house? Was this some kind of sick joke? He grabbed the doll and looked around the room, half expecting to see someone hiding in the shadows, but he was alone. My hands were shaking as I carried the doll back to the shelf. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan of the house. The next morning, I decided to get rid of the doll. I couldn't explain what was happening, but I knew I didn't want it in my house anymore. I threw it onto a box and put it out in the garage far away from the house. As I closed the garage door, I felt a small sense of relief. It was over. The doll was gone. Or so I thought. 8. That night, as I was lying in bed, I heard something. A soft thud, like something falling onto the floor. My blood ran cold. He turned on the light and looked around the room, my heart racing. The shelf was empty. The doll was sitting on the floor. He stared at it in disbelief, my mind spinning. How could this be happening? I had put the doll in the garage. It wasn't possible. And then I noticed something that made me blood turn to ice. The doll's position had changed. Its head was tilted slightly to the side, and its tiny hands were resting on the floor, as if it had crawled toward me. These eyes, those dark, glassy eyes, seemed to glint in the dim light. I backed away, my pulse racing. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't want to go near it, but I had to get it out of the house. With trembling hands, I picked up the doll, avoiding his eyes. I carried it downstairs. I opened the front door and threw it outside into the yard. He didn't care where it landed, I just wanted it gone. I locked the door behind me and went back to bed, hoping that I had finally rid myself of the cursed thing. But the next morning, when I opened the front door, the doll was sitting on the porch. He felt a wave of nausea wash over as I stared down at him. The doll was upright, a cracked porcelain face staring up at me with those same glassy eyes. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the doll, threw it into a bag, and drove to the nearest dumpster. I didn't stop until I was sure I had gotten rid of it for good. That night, for the first time in days, I slept peacefully. Didn't hear any strange noises, didn't wake up to find the doll sitting beside me. But the next morning, when I went to leave for work, the doll was back seating on the shelf in the living room, right where he had been before. And this time, there was a note tucked into its hands. Written on a shaky scrawl were the words, "You cannot get rid of me." Story isn't. The stranger who knew my name. It was one of those unremarkable days. He had left work late, eager to get home after a long, tearing week. The air was cool, with the sun already set behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets. He pulled me jacket tighter around as I made my way to the bus stop. My mind focused on what I was going to eat for dinner and the comfort of my warm apartment. The bus stop wasn't crowded, just a few people waiting in silence. He pulled out my phone, scrolling through social media, mindlessly passing the time. "Hey, Jacob!" I heard my name but didn't immediately react. After all, it wasn't that unusual for someone to call out a name in public, but when I looked up, I realized something strange. I didn't recognize the person standing in front of me. A man, mid-30s, with scruffy hair and worn clothes, was smiling at me. His expression was casual, friendly even, as though we were old friend meeting by chance. But I didn't tell him. I did never seen him before in my life. He called my name again, more insistently this time. "Jacob, right?" He blinked, confused. "Yeah, do I know you?" His smile widened. But there was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. "No yet, but I know you." I stared at him, trying to place his face, but he was no use. There was no spark of recognition, no flicker of memory. He was a complete stranger. I don't think we've met before," I said, my voice uneasy. The man chuckled. No, we haven't it. But I know a lot about you, Jacob. My heart began to race. The way he said my name so familiar, so confident, set off alarm bells in my mind. I glossed around the bus stop, hoping someone else had noticed the conversation. But the few people around were absorbed in their own world, paying no attention to us. I'm sorry, but how do you know me? He asked, my voice betraying the growing fear inside me. The man took a step closer, his eye gleaming in the dim streetlight. You know everything about you, Jacob. I know where you work. I know what you had for lunch today. I know where you live. My stomach dropped. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what he was saying. Was this some kind of twisted prank? Did I have him confused with someone else? But then he rattled off my home address, and I froze it. How do you know that? I whispered, my voice barely audible. The man's smile never wavered. Like I said, I know a lot about you. He felt a panic wash over me. This wasn't just some random encounter. This man knew things about my personal things. My address, my name, my routine. He didn't make sense. I didn't know him. I'd never seen him before, but he seemed to know everything about me. He took a step back, putting some distance between us. Who are you? I demanded, my voice shaking. How do you know all of that? The man didn't answer right away. He just stood there watching me, his smile fading into something colder, more menacing. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. You'll find out soon enough. He didn't wait for an explanation. I turned on my heel and walked away, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't care that the bus was coming, I just needed to get away from him. He hurried down the street, casting nervous glances over my shoulder to make sure he wasn't following me. But he was. I could hear his footstep behind me, slow and deliberate, as if he wasn't in any hurry. I kicked my pace, my mind racing with fear. What did he want? Why was he following me? How did he know so much about me? I rounded a corner, hoping to lose him, but the footsteps kept coming. They were closer now, steady and relentless. I broke into a run, my pulse racing as I darted through the narrow streets, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. But no matter how fast he ran, he was always right behind me. My lungs burned as I reached my apartment building. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly that I almost dropped them. I glossed over my shoulder, half expecting to see him standing right behind me, but the street was empty. The man was nowhere to be seen. He let out a shaky breath, trying to calm myself as I unlocked the door and rushed inside. He slammed it shut, locking me behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. For a few moments, I stood there, my back pressed against the door, listening for any sign that he had followed me. But the only sound was my own ragged breathing and the faint hum of the building. He didn't sleep that night. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The next morning, I told myself that it had all been a misunderstanding. Maybe I had me confused with someone else. Maybe it was some kind of bizarre coincidence. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. And then the text started. It was late afternoon when I received the first one. My phone buzzed, and I glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number. You are home now, aren't you, Jacob? He felt a chill run down my spine. I stared at the message, my heart pounding in my chest. How did this person know I was home? Would he am? The man from last night. He didn't reply. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again. You left your kitchen light on. I froze. I was standing in my living room, the kitchen just a few feet away, and the light was on. I rushed to the window, peering out into the street below. Was he out there, watching me? But the street was empty just like the night before. There was no sign of him. No sign of anyone. Another text came through. You should really close your blinds. He backed away from the window, my heart racing. Whoever this was, they were watching me. They knew where he lived. They knew everything about me. He quickly closed the blind, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the cord. The message didn't stop. Every few minutes, another one would come through, each one more personal than the last. They knew what I was doing, what I was wearing, even what I had eaten for lunch. I called the police. They came to my apartment, took me statement, and assured me that they would look into it, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. They thought it was some kind of prank, and maybe it was. Maybe someone was just messing with me. But it didn't feel like a prank. That night, I barricaded myself in my apartment, checking the locks on the doors and windows over and over again. I kept my phone on silent, not wanting to see any more messages. But even in the silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was out there, watching me. At around midnight, there was a knock on my door. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the door, my mind racing with fear. Was he him? Had he come back? The knock came again, louder this time. He took a step forward, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. Slowly, I opened the door, my breath catching on my throat. The hallway was empty. But there, sitting on the floor just outside my apartment, was a single piece of paper. I picked it up, my hand shaking as I unfolded it. See you soon. Story dues. The wrong number, that knew too much. It was a typical Wednesday afternoon when my phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, but that wasn't unusual. I had been getting a lot of spam calls lately, so I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. Hello, he said, expecting the usual awkward pause, followed by a robotic voice trying to sell me something. But there was no pause. Instead, a woman's voice answered immediately. Hi, is this Sarah? He frowned. No, Siri, I think you have the wrong number. Oh, me mistake, she said, her tone light and friendly. Sorry about that. He was about to hang up when she spoke again. What? Is this Jacob? I froze, the phone still pressed to my ear. Me name wasn't particularly uncommon, but something about the way she said it so casual, so certain sent a shiver down my spine. Yes, he replied cautiously. Do I know you? There was a brief pause on the other end, and for a moment, I thought the call had dropped. But then she laughed softly, a sound that made me skin prickle. No, you don't know me, she said. Not yet. Anyway. Me stomach dropped. What is your name? I asked, my voice betraying the unease I was feeling. Another pause. Then she responded, her voice unnervingly calm. You can call me Amy. I had never met an Amy in my life, and her tone, the way she spoke as if we were already familiar with each other, put me on edge. This was no ordinary wrong number. How do you know my name? I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. She ignored the question. You must be at work right now, right? Busy day. My heart started to race. I glossed around the office, suddenly feeling exposed. I hadn't mentioned where I was, but she knew. How did you know that? I asked, more forcefully this time. She chuckled again, the sound soft, beat unsettling. It doesn't matter. Just wanted to check in on you. You heading home soon, right? The bus should be there in about 20 minutes. He stood up from my desk, my body tense with fear. How did she know that? How could a complete stranger know my schedule, know that I was taking the bus? What is this? Who are you? I demanded, my voice shaking. Her tone shifted, becoming darker, more serious. Don't worry, Jacob. I am just making sure everything is okay. I hung up immediately, my hand shaking as I set the phone down on my desk. My heart was racing, and a cold sweat had broken out across my skin. It had to be a prank, someone messing with me. But how could they know so much about me? About me schedule, my name? I spent the rest of the day on edge, constantly glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me. But everything seemed normal. No one at work looked suspicious, and there was no sign of anyone following me when I left the building. As I waited at the bus stop, I kept checking my phone, half expecting Amy to call again, but she didn't dip. The bus arrived on schedule, and I climbed on, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. For a while, I managed to convince myself that it had just been a weird prank, maybe someone with too much time on their hands. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next day, everything seemed normal until lunch. I was sitting at my desk about to eat the sandwich I packed when my phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Hope you are enjoying that ham sandwich, Jacob." He stared at the screen in disbelief. My blood ran cold as I looked down at the sandwich in my hand. Ambiance is exactly what I had packed that morning. My hands were shaking as I tipped a reply. Who is this?" The response came almost instantly. "You know who it is. I'm just checking in on you again." He felt sick. Whoever this was, they weren't just guessing. They were watching me. They knew exactly what I was doing, what I was eating. But how? I stood up from my desk, glancing around the office, but no one seemed to be paying attention to me. My co-workers were all absorbed in their own tasks, completely unaware of the terror that was creeping over me. He rushed outside, desperate to get away from the prying eyes I couldn't see. He needed air, space to think. But no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I called the number back, my heart pounding in my chest. He rang once, twice, and then she answered. "Jacob, he told you," the woman Amy said. "You don't to worry." "How do you know all of this about me?" I demanded, pacing back and forth on the sidewalk. "Who are you? What do you want?" There was a brief silence on the other end, and then she spoke, her voice calm but chilling. "He already told you. I'm just making sure everything is okay." He hung up, my hands trembling as he stuffed the phone back into my pocket. I wanted to scream, to tell someone what was happening, but who could I tell? No one would believe me. He thought about going to the police, but what would I say? That a woman named Amy had called me and seemed to know everything about me. It sounded ridiculous. Busied? It didn't have any proof, just a few cryptic text messages on a wrong number. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a mistake. For the rest of the day, I tried to avoid thinking about it, but it was impossible. Every time my phone buzzed, I felt a wave of dread wash over me, terrified that it was another message from her. When I finally got home that night, I locked all the doors and windows, pulling the curtain shut. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, even in the safety of my own home. And then, just as I was about to head to bed, my phone buzzed again. "Good night, Jacob. Sleep well." My blood ran cold. I didn't respond. I didn't even dare to look out the window. I just turned off my phone, tossed it across the room, and crawled into bed, pulling the covers up over my head like a child. But I couldn't sleep. The next few days were a blur of fear and paranoia. The calls and texts kept coming, each one more personal than the last. Amy knew everything what I was doing, where I was going, even who I was talking to. It was as if she was everywhere, watching me at all times. I stopped going out. I stopped answering my phone, but he didn't patter. The messages still came, and no matter how hard I tried to escape them, she always found a way to reach me. Then, one night, after days of constant fear and sleepless nights, I received the final message. "I'm coming to see you, Jacob. I'll be there soon." He stared at the words, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. This was not just a prank. This was real. She was coming for me. He grabbed my things and left the apartment, not even bothering to lock the door behind me. He didn't know where I was going, just away from her, away from the messages, away from the terror that had consumed my life. But as he rounded the corner of my street, my phone buzzed again. "I see you?" I froze, looking around wildly. The street was empty, but I could feel it, the eyes on me, the presence lurking just out of sight. And then, from the shadows, I saw her. A woman, standing at the end of the street, her face hidden in the darkness. She didn't move, didn't say a word. She just stood there, watching me. I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with fear. But no matter how fast I ran, I knew she was always going to find me. Because whoever she was, she knew everything. Dirty trees. The email that came from my account. It had been a long day at work, and I was more than ready to unwind. He walked into my apartment, threw my bag on the floor, and collapsed onto the couch, scrolling through my phone to catch up on email before settling in for the night. My inbox was cluttered as usual, work update, junk mail, a few messages from friends. But one email caught my eye. It was from me own name appeared as the sender with my email address clearly displayed. At first, I thought it had to be some kind of phishing scam or a technical glitch, but when I opened the email, my blood ran cold. The subject line read, "I know what you did." He sat up straighter, my pulse kicking. The email itself was short, just a single sentence, but it was enough to send a wave of panic through me. "You thought you could keep it hidden, didn't you?" I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. This had to be a joke, right? Someone was messing with me, but how? How could anyone send an email from my own account? I checked the sender again, but there was no mistake. It was from my email address, me own name staring back at me from the inbox. Me stomach churned as I tried to make sense of it. Was my account hacked? Had someone gained access to my private information? I quickly changed my password, making it longer and more secure, hoping that would solve the problem. But as he sat there, staring at the email, a creeping sense of dread settled over me. Whoever had sent this knew something about me, something I had never told anyone. The secret they were hinting at, it was something I had buried deep inside, something I'd hoped would never resurface. No one knew about it. No one could possibly know. Except me. For the next few hours, I couldn't focus. I paced around my apartment, replaying every detail of that long-forgotten mistake, wondering how someone could have found out. Was he just a lucky guess? Was this some kind of elaborate prank? But the timing, the precision of that message, it was too specific, too targeted. He barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, he imagined the sender lurking somewhere out there, someone who knew my deepest, darkest secret, watching me, waiting to strike. The next morning, I opened my laptop, dreading what I might find in my inbox. Sure enough, there was another email from my own account. This time, the subject line read, "It's not over." My heart raced as I clicked on it. "You cannot run from this, Jacob. I know everything." He felt a wave of nausea. The message was so direct, so confident, that I couldn't dismiss it as a simple hack anymore. Whoever was behind these emails wasn't just trying to scare me, they were sending a message. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had hacked my account and was playing a cruel prank. But how could they know about what happened all those years ago? He had never written me down, never spoken about it, never even let myself think about it for too long. It was a memory I had locked away deep inside, hoping that if I ignored it, it would fade into the past. But now it was resurfacing, and I had no idea how to stop it. I spent the rest of the day in a fog of anxiety, my thoughts consumed by the emails and the secret they threatened to expose. Me work suffered, and I found myself jumping at every sound, every notification on my phone. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was behind this wasn't finished with me yet. That night, I sat at my computer, my fingers hovering over the keyboard as I debated whether to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't happening. But another part of me needed to know who was behind this. He needed answers. Finally, he tipped out a short reply. "Who are you? What do you want?" He sent, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't expect a response right away, but within minutes, my inbox chimed with a new email. The reply was chillingly simple. "You already know," you say. Me blood turned twice. I couldn't breathe. Whoever this was, they were toying with me, playing a game that I couldn't win. And the worst part was, they were right. Deep down, I knew exactly what they wanted. They wanted to punish me for what I had done. But how could they know? I closed the laptop, my mind spinning. The emails had stopped for the time being, but I knew it was only a matter of time before the next one arrived. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Over the next few days, I tried to go about my life as normally as possible, but the constant fear gnawed at me. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would skip a beat, half expecting another message from myself, taunting me with the knowledge of my past. And then, one night, the email came that changed everything. I had just sat down for dinner when my phone buzzed with a notification. I hesitated before opening it, already dreading what I might find. Sure enough, it was another email from my own account. But this one was different. The subject line read, "I'm outside." My heart stopped. I stood up slowly, my mind racing. Was this some kind of sick joke? Was someone really outside my apartment? He moved to the window cautiously, my pulse thundering in my ears. The street below was quiet, the occasional car passing by, but nothing out of the ordinary. No one was standing outside my building. No one was watching me. At least, that is what I thought. Just as he was about to turn away, he saw it. A figure standing in the shadows, just barely visible under the streetlight. They weren't up moving, just standing there, staring up at my window. I stumbled back, my heart racing in my chest. He grabbed at my phone, frantically dialing the police as I kept my eyes on the figure. But by the time I got through, they were gone, vanished into the night. The police arrived a short while later, but there was nothing they could do. No signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been outside. Just my word, on an inbox full of disturbing emails. I tried to explain it to them, but even as the words came out of my mouth, I knew how crazy it sounded. Someone was sending me emails from my own account, threatening me, watching me. They assured me they would investigate, but I could tell they didn't believe me. And honestly, I wasn't sure I believed myself anymore. The email kept coming, but now they were more frequent, more direct. "You cannot hide from me, Jacob. I am always watching. You know what you have to do." He was losing me grip on reality. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think. I started to feel like I was being watched everywhere I went, on the bus, in the grocery store, even in my own apartment. The figure in the shadows haunted my every waking moment. And then, one night, the final email came. "It's time to pay for what you did." He stared at the words on the screen, my hand shaking. My breath came in shallow gasps as he realized what was happening. This wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. I rushed to the door, locking it, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob, praying that it would be enough to keep whoever or whatever was coming for me out. But he wasn't. And a soft knock echoed through the apartment, and I froze, my blood running cold. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, as the knocking grew louder, more insistent. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The knocking stopped. For a few moments, there was nothing but silence. I held my breath, waiting, praying that he was over. And then I heard the sound that would haunt me forever. A voice. My voice. "Jacob, it is time to let me in." Story tears in. The mirror that showed a different reflection. I've always had an uneasy relationship with mirrors. Something about the way they reflect back the world, always reversed, always slightly distorted, has never sat right with me. It's a supple discomfort, like catching a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there, but convincing yourself it is just your imagination. That discomfort became terror the night my reflection moved on his own. It all started when I moved into a new apartment. The place was perfect for me, small, cozy, and just far enough from the city to feel peaceful without being too remote. It had everything I needed, including a large antique mirror that hung in the hallway just outside the bedroom. The landlord told me it had been left behind by the previous tenant, a relic of the old building's history. The mirror was beautiful tile, with an intricately carved wooden frame, the glass slightly warped with age. It gave the hallway air of elegance, but something about it made me uneasy from the moment I first saw it. Maybe it was the way the glass seemed to shimmer, or the way my reflection looked just a little off, like there was something behind the wash, something waiting. Deal. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, it was just a mirror. What harm could he do? The first few nights in the apartment passed without incident. I quickly settled into my new routine, growing accustomed to the creaks and groans of the old building. The mirror became part of the background, something I barely noticed as I moved about my day. But then, one night, something strange happened. It was late past midnight and I had just gotten up to get a glass of water. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamps outside. As he walked past the mirror in the hallway, I glanced at my reflection out of habit, just to make sure I didn't look like a complete mess. That is when I noticed it. My reflection was standing perfectly still. At first, I didn't register what was happening. I had stopped in front of the mirror, and naturally, I expected my reflection to stop too. But there was something off, something that didn't make sense. I blinked, and so did my reflection, but when I shifted slightly, my reflection didn't move. He just stood there, staring back at me, his eyes wide, his body rigid. Me breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I thought he was imagining things. Maybe it was just the poor lighting or the way the shadows played tricks on my eyes. But as I took another step back, my reflection remained frozen in place, a gaze locked on mine. I couldn't move. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the mirror, waiting for anything to happen. But my reflection just stood there, still and silent, like a photograph. He rushed out, hesitatingly, my hand trembling as I moved it closer to the surface of the glass. And then, just as my finger brushed the edge of the mirror, my reflection moved. But he didn't move the way I did. Instead of mirroring my action, my reflection tilted his head slightly to the side, its expression unreadable. It wasn't following me, it was watching me. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be happening. Reflection don't move on their own. They don't have minds of their own. I blinked again, hard, hoping that when I opened my eyes, everything would be back to normal. But when I looked at the mirror, my reflection had shifted even further. He was now facing me directly, its head tilted just a little too far, as if it was studying me, observing my every move. Panic surged through me, and I turned away from the mirror, hurrying back to my bedroom. He slammed the door shut behind me, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't dare look at the mirror again. He couldn't. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my reflection staring back at me, unblinking, unmoving. I told myself it had just been a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next morning, I avoided the hallway as much as possible, keeping my eyes firmly fixed on the ground as I passed the mirror. I couldn't bring myself to look at it. The thought of seeing my reflection move on his own again made my skin crawl. He tried to go about me day as usual, but the memory of that night lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something lurking just behind the surface of the glass. That evening, I decided I had to face it. I couldn't live in fear of my own reflection. It was ridiculous, irrational. I needed to prove to myself that it had all been in my head. I stood in front of the mirror, taking a deep breath as I forced myself to look. My reflection stared back at me, perfectly normal, perfectly still. He moved my hand, and so did my reflection. I tilted my head, and it followed suit. Relief washed over me. It had been a mistake, a moment of paranoia, nothing more. He had let my imagination get the best of me. But just as I was about to turn away, something changed. The mirror's surface shimmered just for a moment like ripples on water. And then, my reflection smiled. But he wasn't smiling. He froze, my blood turning to ice as I stared at the mirror. My reflection's smile was wide, too wide, stretching across its face in a way that no human expression ever should. His eye glittered with a cold, unnatural light, and as I stood there, paralyzed with fear, it took a step forward. My reflection moved toward the surface of the glass, its smile never faltering. He stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest, but my reflection didn't stop. He pressed his hands against the inside of the mirror. Its fingers splayed across the glass, as if it was trying to push its way out. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was watch in horror as my reflection leaned closer, its face now inches from the surface. And then, he spoke. His voice was me voice, but twisted, distorted, as if it was coming from somewhere far away. Let me out. He backed away, my pulse racing, me mind spinning. This couldn't be happening. Mirrors don't move, reflection don't speak. But there it was, staring back at me. Its smile widened with every second that passed. "Let me out," he repeated, louder this time, its voice echoing through the hallway. "You don't need me in here. Let me out." He turned around, my heart hammering in my chest, as I bolted out of the apartment. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the street, gasping for air, my mind still reeling from what I had just seen. I didn't go back to the apartment that night. He couldn't. The memory of my reflection, its smile, its voice was burned into my mind, and the thought of facing that mirror again filled me with a terror I couldn't explain. The next day, I called my landlord and asked about the mirror. I wanted to know where it had come from, who had left it behind. Maybe there was some explanation, some history that could shed light on what had happened. But when I asked, the landlord seemed confused. "The mirror?" he said. "There shouldn't be a mirror in the apartment. The last tenant didn't leave anything behind." He stared at the phone, my mind racing. That couldn't be right. The mirror had been there since the day I moved in. Or had he? He hung up, my hand trembling. The mirror, he wasn't supposed to be there, but he was. And now I couldn't get rid of it. I went back to the apartment later that day, determined to get the mirror out of my life for good. He didn't care where it had come from. I didn't care if it was cursed or haunted or something worse. I just needed it gone. But when I stepped onto the hallway, the mirror was gone. The wall where it hung was bare, as if it had never been there at all. I stood there, staring at the empty space, my mind spinning. I hadn't moved it. No one had been in the apartment since I left. But the mirror was gone. And so was my reflection. Story 15. The package I didn't order. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when the package showed up at my door. I had been working from home all day. The sound of the steady rain outside a soothing backdrop to the dull hum of my computer. There was nothing unusual about the day. In fact, it had been the kind of uneventful, quiet day that I had come to appreciate. Then, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. And I certainly wasn't expecting any deliveries. I hadn't ordered anything recently, and I hadn't seen the mail carrier pass by. But when I opened the door, there it was, a brown, unmarked package sitting on my doorstep. It wasn't very large, about the size of a shoebox, and there was no return address, no label, just my name scribbled in messy handwriting on a plain white piece of paper taped to the top. I stared at it for a moment, puzzled. There was no indication of where it had come from or who had sent it. Curiosity got the better of me. I picked up the package, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It was heavier than I expected, and something inside shifted as I moved it. I brought it inside, setting it down on the kitchen table as I tried to make sense of it. Had I forgotten about an order? Maybe it was a gift, or a mistake. I checked the label again, but there was no mistake. It was addressed to me. With a sense of unease gnawing at the back of my mind, I grabbed a pair of scissors and carefully cut through the tape. The box creaked as I opened it, the cardboard edges stiff from being sealed so tightly. Inside was a smaller box, wrapped in old, yellowed newspaper. I frowned as I pulled it out, the paper crinkling under my fingers. There was something unsettling about the way it was wrapped, like someone had gone out of their way to make it look like it had been hidden away for years. I unwrapped the newspaper, revealing a small, intricately carved wooden box. The wood was dark and worn, the carving strange and unfamiliar symbols I didn't recognize, swirling patterns that seemed almost alive. My fingers traced the lines, the texture rough and cold. A wave of unease washed over me as I realized I had no idea what I was dealing with. There was something off about the box, something that made the air around it feel heavier, darker. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the lid. Part of me wanted to leave it alone, to walk away and pretend I had never opened the package, but my curiosity wouldn't let me. I needed to know what was inside. I lifted the lid, and inside the box was a small, folded piece of paper and a single tarnished key. The key was old, its once shiny metal now dull and scratched, as if it had been used over and over for years. But it was the note that made my heart skip a beat. The paper was yellowed and brittle, the edges frayed from age. Written in the same messy handwriting as the label on the package, it read, "Do not use the key dot." My stomach dropped. I stared at the note, my mind racing. What was this? Some kind of prank? Who would go to the trouble of sending me a package with a cryptic note like this? And why? I looked at the key again, its cold metal gleaming dully in the dim light of my kitchen. It looked so ordinary, so harmless, but the warning in the note echoed in my mind, filling me with a sense of dread I couldn't explain. I shoved the key back into the box and closed the lid, suddenly feeling a wave of anxiety wash over me. The whole situation felt wrong, like I had stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to. I pushed the box to the corner of the table, telling myself I would deal with it later. But as the day wore on, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The key, the note, the strange carvings on the box, they gnawed at the edges of my mind, refusing to be ignored. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the moment I had opened the box, the feeling of dread that had settled over me as I read the note. Do not use the key dot. What key? What did it open? Why had it been sent to me? I tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was as if the box had brought a darkness into my home, a presence that I couldn't see but could feel watching me. By the next morning, I had convinced myself it was just a prank, an elaborate, unsettling prank, but a prank nonetheless. Still, I couldn't bring myself to throw the box away. I told myself it was because I wanted to figure out who had sent it, but deep down, I knew there was more to it than that. The box stayed in the corner of my kitchen for days, untouched but always there, a constant reminder of the mystery that had arrived at my door. And then, one night, everything changed. I woke up to a sound of soft, metallic scraping, like something being dragged across a hard surface. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest as I listened. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. It was coming from the kitchen. I crept out of bed, my pulse racing as I moved down the hallway. The house was dark and still, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, casting long shadows across the walls. As I reached the kitchen, I saw it. The box. It was no longer on the table. It was on the floor, the lid slightly ajar. My blood turned to ice. I hadn't touched the box since I opened it. There was no way it could have moved on its own. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat as I knelt down to examine it. The key was gone. I felt a wave of panic surge through me as I frantically searched the floor, hoping it had just fallen out of the box. But it wasn't there. The key was gone, and I had no idea where it had gone or how it had disappeared. That's when I noticed something else. There was a new note inside the box. With trembling hands, I picked it up, the paper rough and brittle against my skin. The message was short, but it made my heart stop. You shouldn't have opened IT dot. I stumbled back, my mind spinning. The note hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. Someone had been in my house. Someone had left that note, taken the key, and was now watching me. For the next few days, I was on edge, jumping at every sound, every creak of the old house. I locked all the doors, checked the windows, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was waiting. And then, the nightmares began. Every night, I dreamed of the key. I dreamed of doors old, ancient doors hidden in the dark, each one locked, each one waiting to be opened. I saw the key in my hand, felt the cold metal against my skin as I turned it in the lock. And every time I would wake up just as the door creaked open, my heart pounding in my chest, a cold sweat covering my skin. One night, I woke up to the sound of knocking. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the quiet house. It was coming from inside. I stumbled out of bed, my pulse racing as I moved toward the hallway. The knocking continued, steady and deliberate, growing louder with every step I took. It was coming from behind the mirror in the hallway. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The knocking was clear now, loud and rhythmic, as if something or someone was on the other side, trying to get out. I reached out, my hand trembling as I touched the surface of the mirror. And then, the knocking stopped. For a long moment, The house was silent. I stood there, my hand still pressed against the mirror, waiting for something to happen. And then I saw a faint outline, just beneath the surface of the glass. A shadow moving ever so slightly, as if something was trapped inside, watching me. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest as I stumbled back into the bedroom. The knocking didn't return, but the presence, whatever it was, remained. The next morning, I found another note slipped under my door. "It's too late now, Dot." I never found out who sent the package or what the key was meant to open, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever I had unlocked, whatever I had let into my home, it wasn't going away. Story 16. The stranger in my photos. It all started when I decided to clean out my phone. I had hundreds, maybe even thousands of photos cluttering up my storage, random snapshots from vacations, nights out with friends, and the mundane moments of life. Most of them were unremarkable, the kind of photos you keep but never really look at again. As I scrolled through my gallery, I started deleting the blurry pictures, duplicates, and old screenshots. It was late at night, and the task was mindless, almost soothing. I was halfway through my vacation photos when something caught my eye. A face. I stopped scrolling, my thumb hovering over the screen as I stared at the image. It was a picture I had taken a few weeks ago during a hiking trip with friends. We were on a trail in the mountains, surrounded by trees, the sun setting in the background. The picture showed me and my friends smiling, posing with the beautiful view behind us. But there, in the background, barely visible between the trees, was a man. He was standing off to the side, partially obscured by the shadows of the forest. His face was pale, his expression unreadable, and his eyes were staring directly at the camera. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't remember anyone being there when I took the picture. It had just been me and my friends on that trail. The area had been deserted, far from the usual tourist spots. There shouldn't have been anyone else around. I zoomed in on the photo, trying to get a better look at the man. His features were blurry, distorted by the shadows, but there was no mistaking the fact that he was staring straight at the camera, straight at me. A wave of unease washed over me as I scrolled through the rest of the photos from that day. None of the other pictures showed the man. He was only in that one image, standing in the background, watching us. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just another hiker passing by, someone I hadn't noticed at the time. But something about his presence felt wrong, unnatural. The way he was standing there, so still, so silent, made my skin crawl. I put my phone down, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. But as the night wore on, I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the photo, his pale face, his staring eyes. It haunted me. The next day, I showed the picture to my friends, hoping they might remember seeing him, but none of them did. They all insisted that we had been alone on the trail, that no one else had been around. Maybe it's just someone in the background you didn't notice, one of my friends suggested. But her voice wavered, and I could tell she was just as unsettled as I was. Over the next few days, I tried to forget about the photo, but every time I opened my phone, it was there, lurking in my gallery, a constant reminder of the man who shouldn't have been there. I thought about deleting it, but something stopped me. It was as if I needed to keep it to understand what was happening. Then, a few nights later, I took another look at the photo and noticed something that made my blood run cold. The man had moved. He wasn't standing in the same spot anymore. In the original picture, he had been partially hidden by the trees, his face barely visible. But now he was standing closer to the foreground, his face clearer, his eyes even more intense. I stared at the image, my heart pounding in my chest. How was this possible? Photos don't change. People don't move after the picture's been taken. I frantically scrolled through the rest of my gallery, my fingers trembling. The other photos from that day hadn't changed. It was just this one, the one with the man. And now he was closer, watching. I turned off my phone, my mind racing. It couldn't be real. There had to be some kind of explanation. Maybe the photo had glitched, or maybe I was just imagining things. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The man in the photo wasn't just a coincidence. He wasn't supposed to be there. The next morning, I took my phone to a tech expert, hoping they could explain what was happening. I showed them the photo, explaining how the man had moved, how his position had changed. But when they looked at the image, they shook their head. "There's no way this could happen," the text said, frowning. "Photos don't just change like that. It's probably just a trick of the light, or maybe your memory is playing tricks on you." I knew they were wrong. I knew what I had seen. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the man, his face getting closer, his eyes boring into mine, was burned into my mind. I kept my phone on the nightstand, the screen turned off, but I could feel its presence like a weight in the room. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a buzzing sound. I reached for my phone, thinking it was a notification, but when I looked at the screen, my stomach dropped. It was the photo. The image had opened on its own, the man now closer than ever. His face filled the screen, his eyes wide and lifeless, his expression blank. I dropped the phone, my heart racing as I backed away from the nightstand. Then, the screen flickered, and the man smiled. It was the most unnatural, horrifying smile I had ever seen. His lips stretched too wide, his teeth unnervingly white, his eyes still locked on mine. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. All I could do was stare at the screen in terror as the man's smile grew wider, more menacing. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the screen went dark. I sat there in the darkness, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my body frozen with fear. I didn't dare touch the phone. I didn't dare look at the screen again. The next morning, I deleted the photo. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought that deleting the image would get rid of the man, erase him from my life, but I was wrong. A few days later, as I was going through my phone, I found a new photo in my gallery. It was a picture of my bedroom. I hadn't taken it. The photo was taken from the corner of the room, near the window. The angle was strange, almost as if someone had been standing there, watching me. And there, in the photo, was my bed. The covers were rumpled, and my phone was lying on the nightstand. But that wasn't the worst part. Standing in the corner, partially hidden by the shadows, was the man. His eyes were wide, his expression blank, his body still as a statue. He was watching me, just like he had been in the first photo. But this time, he wasn't in the background. This time, he was in my room. I stared at the image, my hands shaking, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. I hadn't taken this picture. I hadn't even been in the room when it was taken. But there he was standing there, watching, waiting. I deleted the photo immediately, my heart pounding in my chest, but I knew it wasn't over. That night, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing again. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what was waiting for me. But I had no choice. I reached for the phone, my fingers trembling as I unlocked the screen. There was a new photo in my gallery. It was a picture of me, sleeping. And there in the background, standing by the foot of my bed, was the man. Story 17. The room I never knew existed. It was the kind of discovery that you don't expect to make in your own home, a hidden room behind the walls, forgotten and untouched for years. My house wasn't particularly old or grand, just a modest 2-story place that I had bought a few years ago. I had always liked the house, but now it felt different. Now it felt like it was hiding something from me. It all started when I decided to renovate the basement. The space had been mostly unused since I moved in, just a storage area filled with old boxes and forgotten furniture. I had big plans for it, though, a game room, maybe a small home gym. But as I began to clear out the clutter, I noticed something strange. There was a section of the wall that didn't quite match the rest of the basement. It looked newer, as if it had been patched up more recently than the other walls. At first, I thought it was just a repair job, maybe a fix from a previous owner, but the more I looked at it, the more curious I became. Why would someone patch up part of the wall when the rest of the basement was clearly older, untouched? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a hammer and started tapping on the wall. The sound was hollow, unlike the solid thud I had expected. I tapped again, harder this time, and the plaster crumbled slightly, revealing what looked like a wooden door behind it. A hidden door. My heart raced. I had lived in the house for years and had no idea this was here. I couldn't believe it. I carefully chipped away at the plaster, revealing more of the door. It was small, barely tall enough for an adult to walk through without ducking, and the wood was old, cracked in places but still sturdy. There was no handle, just a keyhole. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door, my mind racing with questions. Why had this room been sealed off? What was inside? Part of me didn't want to find out, but I knew I couldn't leave it alone. I needed to know what was behind that door. I went upstairs to grab a flashlight and a crowbar, determined to pry the door open. When I returned to the basement, I noticed something strange. The air was colder, and the basement felt different, as if the very atmosphere had changed since I discovered the door. With a deep breath, I jammed the crowbar into the crack between the door and the frame, pushing with all my strength. The wood groaned in protest, but after a few minutes the door gave way, swinging open with a creak. A gust of cold, musty air rushed out, and I instinctively covered my nose, the smell of damp wood and mildew filling the air. I shined the flashlight into the room, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was small, just big enough for a few pieces of furniture. It was empty except for an old, worn chair sitting in the center and a shelf on the far wall. The walls were made of rough stone, the kind you'd expect to find in a much older building, not in a house like mine. I stepped inside, the floor creaking under my weight. The air was thick and stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. I moved the flashlight around the room, my pulse quickening as I took in the eerie sight. That's when I noticed the writing. It was faint, barely visible in the dim light, but there, on the wall opposite the door, were words scrawled in what looked like charcoal. The writing was erratic, the letters uneven, as if they had been drawn in a hurry. I moved closer, shining the flashlight over the words, and my blood ran cold as I read them. Don't let it out, Dot. A chill ran down my spine. What did that mean? What was it? I looked around the room again, my heart racing, but there was nothing there, just the chair and the shelf. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something unseen, lurking in the shadows of the hidden room. I moved closer to the shelf, my hands trembling as I shined the flashlight over it. It was covered in dust, the wood warped and rotting in places. There were a few old, faded books sitting on it, their covers worn and cracked. I reached out, my fingers brushing against one of the books, when I heard it. A soft, scratching sound. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was faint, but unmistakable, like nails dragging across wood. I turned slowly, shining the flashlight toward the source of the noise, but the room was empty. The scratching continued, growing louder, more insistent, as if something or someone was trying to get out. The sound was coming from the walls. I backed away, my heart racing, my mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, echoing through the small room. It sounded like it was coming from inside the walls, like something was trapped behind the stone. I turned and bolted out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't know what I had just heard, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going back into that room. I tried to forget about it, to pretend that the room didn't exist, but the memory of the scratching haunted me. Every time I went into the basement, I could feel it, an unease, a presence that I couldn't explain. The air down there felt colder, heavier, as if the room was waiting for something. And then, one night, the nightmares began. I dreamed of the room. I dreamed of the chair, the shelf, the writing on the wall. But in the dream, the room wasn't empty. There was something sitting in the chair, something shrouded in shadow, watching me. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, feel the weight of its gaze. In the dream, the scratching was louder, more intense, as if whatever was behind the walls was trying to break free. And every time, just as the door creaked open, I would wake up, my heart pounding, drenched in sweat. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong, that I had unleashed something the moment I opened that door. A few days later, I went back into the basement, determined to seal the door and forget the room ever existed. But when I got down there, the door was open. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring at the open door, my blood turning to ice. I hadn't touched it since that day. I hadn't even gone near it. But now, it was wide open. I knew I shouldn't go inside, knew I should leave it alone, but something compelled me to move forward, to see what had changed. The room looked the same as it had before: the chair, the shelf, the writing on the wall. But this time, something was different. There was a new message scrawled on the wall, written in the same erratic handwriting as before. "It's out, Dot." And I stumbled back, my heart racing, my mind reeling. What was out? What had I let out? That night, the scratching returned, but this time, it wasn't coming from the walls of the hidden room. It was coming from inside my house. I lay in bed, frozen in fear, listening as the scratching moved through the walls, closer and closer. It wasn't just nails against wood anymore, it was something heavier, something dragging itself through the house. And then I heard it, a soft creak, like a door slowly opening. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming from the basement. I grabbed my phone, dialing the police, my hands shaking as I tried to explain what was happening. They told me to stay on the line, to wait until they arrived. But the sound, the dragging, the creaking was getting closer. I couldn't wait. I ran out of the house, not stopping until I was halfway down the street, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't care about the house anymore. I didn't care about the hidden room, or what I had found inside. All I knew was that whatever I had let out was still in there, and it wasn't going to stay hidden for long. Story 18. The voice on the baby monitor. It was supposed to be an ordinary night, like so many others before it. My wife and I had just put our baby daughter, Lily, to bed, and we finally had a moment to relax. It was around 10:30 p.m., and we were sitting on the couch, watching TV when I heard it. A voice. I froze, my hand hovering over the remote, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was faint, barely audible over the hum of the television, but it was unmistakable, a voice coming through the baby monitor. At first, I thought it was just Lily babbling in her sleep, the way babies sometimes do. But as I turned down the volume on the TV, I realized that the voice wasn't hers. It was deeper, slower, and clearly not that of a child. It was someone else. I stared at the baby monitor, my heart racing. The small screen showed Lily lying peacefully in her crib, the soft glow of her nightlight casting gentle shadows across the room. She wasn't moving, and the room was silent. But the voice was still there. Someone was in her room. I grabbed my wife's arm, my voice barely a whisper. "Do you hear that?" She nodded, her eyes wide with fear as we both listened, straining to make out the words. The voice was soft, almost soothing, like someone whispering a lullaby. But there was something off about it, something that sent a chill down my spine. "I think we should check on her," my wife said, her voice shaking. Without hesitation, we both stood up and rushed down the hallway, our hearts pounding in our chests. When we reached Lily's room, everything looked normal. She was still lying in her crib, sound asleep, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. There was no one else there. But as we stood there staring down at her, the baby monitor crackled to life again. The voice returned, louder this time, clearer. "She's such a beautiful baby, Dot." I froze, my blood turning to ice as the words echoed through the room. My wife gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as we both turned to look at the baby monitor. The screen was showing Lily, as it always did, but there was something else, something that hadn't been there before. A shadow. It was faint, barely noticeable at first, but there, near the corner of the room, was a dark, indistinct shape hovering just out of the camera's reach. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the screen, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. I quickly scanned the room, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there, nothing but Lily, peacefully asleep in her crib. I picked up the baby monitor, my hands trembling as I moved the camera around, trying to find the source of the shadow. But every time I moved the camera, the shadow seemed to shift, staying just out of view, always lingering at the edge of the frame. The voice returned, softer this time, almost a whisper. "Don't worry, I'll take care of her, Dot." I backed away from the crib, my heart racing, my mind reeling. Who was saying this? Who was in my daughter's room? My wife grabbed my arm, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to leave." We hurried out of the room, taking Lily with us, my hands trembling as I cradled her against my chest. The baby monitor crackled again, the voice growing fainter, more distant. "She's mine, Dot." I slammed the door shut behind us, my heart pounding in my ears. I couldn't believe what I had just heard, what I had just seen. The voice, the shadow, it didn't make sense. There was no one else in the house. We were alone, weren't we? For the rest of the night, we kept Lily with us, refusing to put her back in her crib. We tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard that voice, soft and unsettling, whispering through the baby monitor. By morning, we were both exhausted, barely able to process what had happened. I wanted to believe it had been a glitch, some kind of interference, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The voice had spoken to us. It had spoken about Lily. And it wasn't finished. Over the next few days, I avoided using the baby monitor as much as possible, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house felt different, colder, darker. Every time I walked past Lily's room, I felt a chill run down my spine, as if something was watching me. Then, one night, it happened again. I had just put Lily to bed and was sitting in the living room when the baby monitor crackled to life. At first, it was just static, a low hum of white noise that filled the room. But then I heard the voice. "She's waiting for M.E. Dot." My blood ran cold. I grabbed the baby monitor, my hands shaking as I stared at the screen. Lily was in her crib just like before, but there was something different about the room this time. The shadows were darker, deeper, as if the light wasn't reaching every corner. And then I saw it. The shadow. It was back, but this time it wasn't lingering at the edge of the frame. It was closer, much closer, standing near the crib, hovering over my daughter. I felt a wave of panic surge through me as I rushed toward Lily's room, my heart pounding in my chest. I threw open the door, my breath catching in my throat as I looked around the room. Nothing. The room was empty. Just Lily, fast asleep in her crib, her soft breathing the only sound in the room. I picked her up, cradling her in my arms as I looked around, searching for any sign of the shadow, of the voice. But there was nothing, no sign that anyone had been there at all. As I stood there, holding Lily close, the baby monitor crackled again. The voice was softer now, almost a whisper. "You can't keep her from M.E. Dot." I felt a wave of fear wash over me as I rushed out of the room, my mind racing. Who was this? What did they want with my daughter? I couldn't make sense of it, couldn't explain what was happening. All I knew was that I couldn't let Lily stay in that room. For the next few nights, we kept her with us, refusing to leave her alone, refusing to turn on the baby monitor. But the house didn't feel safe anymore. Every time I walked past her room, I felt that cold, creeping sensation like something was waiting, just out of sight. Then, one night, after days of sleepless fear, I decided to turn the baby monitor on again. I needed to know if the voice was still there, if the shadow was still watching. I sat in the living room, the monitor in my lap, the screen showing Lily fast asleep in her room. For a while, everything seemed normal. The house was quiet. The only sound, the soft hum of the monitor static. And then, just as I was about to turn it off, the voice returned. "You'll never escape M.E. Dot." I stared at the monitor, my heart racing, my hands trembling. The screen flickered, the image distorting for a moment before going dark. I tried to turn it back on, but the monitor wouldn't respond. The screen stayed black, the voice fading into the static, but I knew it was still there. I rushed to check on Lily, my heart pounding in my chest as I burst into the room. She was still asleep, her tiny body curled up under the blankets, but the air felt different, colder, heavier, as if the very walls were closing in around us. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to stop it. The next morning, I threw the baby monitor away, hoping that would put an end to it. But the voice, the shadow, stayed with me. Every night I heard it in my dreams, soft and whispering, just beyond the edge of my consciousness. "She's mine now, Dot." Story 19. The creepy text that knew my every move. It all started with a text, one that seemed innocent enough at first. I was sitting in my car after work, getting ready to head home when my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen, expecting a message from a friend or a reminder from a work app, but it was from an unknown number. "How was your day, Sarah?" I frowned. I didn't recognize the number, and the way the message was phrased was unsettling, like it came from someone who knew me well. Still, I figured it had to be a wrong number. I ignored it, hoping that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. Ha! A few minutes later, another text came through. "Heading home now." I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I hadn't told anyone I was leaving work. I looked around, scanning the parking lot, but there was no one near my car. No one who could have known I was getting ready to head home. I responded, my fingers trembling slightly as I typed. "Who is this?" The reply came almost instantly. "You'll find out soon enough, Dot." My stomach twisted in knots. Was this a joke? Was someone messing with me? I looked around again, my pulse quickening, but the parking lot was mostly empty. I shoved my phone into my bag, started the car, and drove home, trying to shake the growing sense of dread. When I got home, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but there was no one. I convinced myself it was a prank, something stupid that would blow over. That night, I put my phone on silent and tried to forget about the texts, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the unknown sender watching me, tracking my every move. The next morning, I woke up to another text. "Sleep well?" Well, my blood ran cold. Whoever this was, they hadn't stopped. They were still watching, still keeping tabs on me. I felt my heart race as I typed out another reply. "Who are you? What do you want?" The response was almost immediate. Don't worry, I'm just looking out for you, Dot." I stared at the screen, my stomach churning with fear and confusion. Why would someone say that? Who would go to the trouble of sending these messages? I didn't know anyone who would do something like this, at least I didn't think I did. I tried to block the number, hoping that would end it, but later that afternoon, as I was leaving for lunch, another text came through. "Nice outfit, Sarah. Red looks good on you, Dot." I stopped dead in my tracks. I was wearing a red sweater that day. My hands shook as I looked around, scanning the street for anyone suspicious, but no one stood out. The realization hit me hard someone was watching me, and they were getting closer. I rushed back to my office, my heart racing, and locked myself in the bathroom. I didn't know what to do. The texts were getting creepier, more personal. Whoever this was, they knew too much. But how? I decided to call the police. I explained the situation, but without any concrete threats, there wasn't much they could do. They told me to block the number again, to be careful, and to let them know if anything escalated. That night, I tried to convince myself that it would stop. Maybe the person would get bored and move on. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. At around 11 p.m., my phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what they had sent, but I had to know. "I'm outside, Dot." My heart pounded in my chest. I rushed to the window, peering out into the dark street. There was nothing, no one. But the message hung in the air, filling me with a deep sense of dread. My mind raced as I checked all the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked. Just as I finished locking the back door, another text came through. "You can't keep me out, Dot." Oh, I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. Whoever this was, they were playing some kind of sick game and I didn't know how to stop it. I called the police again, my voice shaking as I explained what was happening. They promised to send someone to check the area, but by the time they arrived, there was no one outside. For the next few days, I tried to go about my life as usual, but the texts kept coming. They described everything I did, what I wore, where I went, who I talked to. Whoever this was, they were always watching, always lurking just out of sight. Then, one night, I got a message that made my blood run cold. "I'm coming inside, Dot." I bolted up from the couch, my heart racing as I checked the front door. It was locked, just as I had left it. I moved to the back door, locked. Every window locked. Another text came through. "I'm already here, Dot." Panic surged through me as I rushed through the house, checking every room, every corner, but there was no one. The house was empty. Then my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a picture. A picture of me. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The photo was taken from behind me right where I was sitting on the couch just moments before. My blood ran cold as I realized what that meant. The person wasn't outside. They had been inside the whole time. I called the police again, my voice frantic as I explained what had happened. They sent officers to my house immediately, but by the time they arrived, the person was gone. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been in the house. But I knew they had been there. I could feel it. I spent the next few days staying with a friend, too terrified to be alone in my own house. I thought about leaving the city, starting over somewhere new, but I knew that wouldn't solve anything. Whoever this was, they wouldn't stop. They would find me again. The texts continued, even after I changed my number, even after I got a new phone. Each message more personal than the last. You can't escape M.E. I know everything about you. We'll be together soon. I blocked every number they used, but new ones kept coming. It didn't matter what I did, they always found a way to reach me. The texts haunted my every waking moment, filling me with a constant sense of dread. Then, one night, everything came to a head. I was sitting in bed, my heart racing as I read the latest text. I'm right outside your room. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my phone, frantically dialing 911, but before I could hit the call button, another message came through. Don't bother. It's too late. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I could hear it now, footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming down the hallway outside my room. I backed up against the wall, my pulse thundering in my ears. The door creaked open. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the faint light from the hallway. I couldn't make out their face, couldn't see who they were. And then, they spoke. I told you, I know everything about you. I never saw their face. I never found out who they were. All I know is that, from that moment on, my life was never the same. The text stopped after that night, but the fear didn't. Every time I hear my phone buzz, my heart skips a beat. Every time I'm alone in the house, I feel their presence, watching, waiting. Because I know that one day the texts will start again. And this time, there won't be anywhere left to run. Story 20. The neighbor who watched me through the walls. I had always considered myself lucky to have quiet neighbors. Living in an old apartment building with thin walls, I was used to hearing everything, people arguing, kids running down the hall, the faint hum of music coming from next door. But my new neighbor was different. He kept to himself, never made any noise, and seemed polite enough the few times I'd bumped into him in the hallway. For the first few months, I didn't think much about him at all. That all changed when the notes started appearing. It began innocently enough, just a slip of paper under my door, scrawled in messy handwriting, I see you. At first, I thought it was a joke, maybe a prank by one of the neighborhood kids. I crumpled it up and threw it away without giving it much thought. But a few days later, another note appeared. I'm watching you. This time I felt a chill run down my spine. The handwriting was the same, jagged, uneven, like it had been written in a hurry. I glanced around the hallway, but there was no one in sight. I started to feel uneasy. Who was leaving these notes? Was it a joke? Or something more sinister? I tried to brush it off, but as the days went by, more notes appeared, each one more unsettling than the last. I know when you're alone. You can't hide from M.E. I see everything. By now, I was thoroughly creeped out. I checked my locks every night, double-checking the windows to make sure they were shut tight. But no matter how careful I was, the notes kept coming. One night, after a particularly long day at work, I found a new note tucked under my door. This one was different, shorter, more direct. I'm closer than you think. My blood ran cold. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Someone who knew my routine, my schedule. Someone who was far too close for comfort. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the old building, Every sound from the neighboring apartments set my nerves on edge. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the notes were probably a prank, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Then, one evening, as I was sitting on the couch, I heard an unmistakable sound. Breathing. And I froze, my heart racing as I strained to listen. It wasn't coming from outside, and it wasn't the kind of muffled noise you'd expect from thin walls. It was close, too close, like someone was just on the other side of the room, hidden behind the walls. I stood up, my pulse pounding in my ears as I moved slowly around the apartment. The breathing continued, soft and deliberate, as if someone was deliberately trying not to be heard. I pressed my ear against the wall, my skin prickling with unease. And then I heard it. A voice. It was faint, barely audible, but I could hear it, someone whispering my name. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat as I stared at the wall. I knew what I had heard, and it wasn't my imagination. Someone was behind the walls. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling as I called the building manager. My voice was shaking as I explained what had been happening, the notes, the breathing, the voice. The manager seemed skeptical at first, but I insisted that something wasn't right. He promised to check it out in the morning. That night, I locked myself in my bedroom, refusing to sleep in the living room. I pushed the dresser against the door, my heart racing with every sound I heard. I could feel it now. Something wasn't just watching me. It was closer than ever. The next morning, the building manager knocked on my door. He looked tired, like he'd been up all night thinking about my call. I checked the neighboring apartment, he said, rubbing his neck. The tenant your neighbor moved out a few months ago. No one's been living there since. I stared at him in disbelief. That's impossible. I've heard someone in there. I've seen him. The manager shook his head. It's been vacant since the last guy left. I don't know what to tell you. My stomach dropped. How could it be vacant? I had seen my neighbor just a few days ago, in fact, and I had heard someone moving around in the apartment more than once. I decided to take matters into my own hands. That night, I stayed up late, listening for the sounds again. I knew they were real. I wasn't imagining them, and if no one was living next door, that meant the noises, the breathing, the whispering, they were coming from somewhere else. As the clock ticked past midnight, I heard it again, the faint sound of breathing, this time clearer, more distinct. It was coming from the wall near my bed, the same wall that separated my apartment from the vacant one next door. My heart pounded as I pressed my ear to the wall, listening carefully. And then, just as before, I heard the voice. I can see you, Dot. I pulled away from the wall, my skin crawling with fear. Whoever was behind the wall knew I was there. They knew I could hear them. I grabbed a flashlight and moved toward the wall. My hands shook as I tapped on the surface, listening for any hollow spots. The wall sounded solid, but something wasn't right. The sounds were too clear, too close. That's when I noticed the small, almost imperceptible crack running along the baseboard, right where the wall met the floor. It was faint, barely noticeable, but as I crouched down for a closer look, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a small hole in the wall. Not a large hole, but just big enough to see through. My breath caught in my throat as I peered through the hole. On the other side, I saw the empty apartment, dark, silent, just as the building manager had said. But there in the corner of the room was a figure. A man. He was standing perfectly still, his face obscured by shadows, but I could feel his eyes on me. He wasn't moving, wasn't saying anything, just standing there, watching. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I had just seen. The building manager had said the apartment was empty, that no one had been living there for months, but I had seen someone. Someone was in there, someone who had been watching me through the walls. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The image of the man standing in the shadows burned into my mind. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind outside sent my nerves on edge. The next day, I demanded that the building manager inspect the neighboring apartment again. Reluctantly, he agreed. We both entered the apartment together, the door creaking as we stepped inside. It was exactly as he had described, empty, abandoned, dust collecting on the floors. There was no furniture, no signs of life, just the hollow echo of our footsteps as we moved through the space. But then I showed him the wall. I pointed to the small hole I had found, my hands shaking as I explained what I had seen, what I had heard. The manager frowned, his expression shifting from skepticism to concern as he crouched down to inspect it. "That's not supposed to be here," he muttered, more to himself than to me. He promised to have the wall sealed, to make sure no one could see through it again, but I could tell by the look on his face that he was just as unnerved as I was. I moved out a few days later. I couldn't stay there. Not after everything that had happened, not after what I had seen. The idea of someone watching me through the walls, silently observing my every move, was too much to bear. But even now, months later, I still feel it. The sensation of being watched. The feeling that someone somewhere is always looking. Because I never found out who was behind that wall. And I never found out how long they had been watching me. Story 21. The phone call I got after midnight. It was just after midnight when my phone rang. The sound jolted me awake, pulling me out of the deep, dreamless sleep I had been in. For a moment I was disoriented, blinking against the darkness of my bedroom, trying to figure out where I was and why my heart was racing. Then I realized the phone was still ringing. I glanced at the clock on my nightstand. 12:13 a.m. No one ever called me this late, especially not on a weeknight. With a sigh, I reached for the phone, expecting it to be a wrong number, maybe some telemarketer who didn't realize they were dialing a different time zone. But when I looked at the screen, there was no number, just unknown caller. A strange, uneasy feeling settled in my chest as I stared at the screen. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. "Hello," I said, my voice thick with sleep. There was silence on the other end for a few seconds, just the faint sound of static, like a bad connection. I was about to hang up when I heard a voice. "I've been waiting for you, Dot." The voice was soft, almost a whisper, and distinctly unfamiliar. I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to process what I was hearing. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. The voice didn't answer right away. There was another brief pause, followed by a low, unsettling chuckle. "You don't remember me, do you?" A chill ran down my spine. I had no idea who this person was or what they were talking about. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Was this some kind of prank? Had someone gotten my number and decided to mess with me? "I think you have the wrong number," I said, my voice firmer now. "I don't know who you are." The voice chuckled again, and the sound made my skin crawl. "Oh, but I know you, Sarah." My blood ran cold. They knew my name. "How do you know my name?" I demanded, my pulse quickening. "Who are you?" "Ian." The line crackled with static, and for a moment I thought the call had dropped. But then the voice came again, softer now, almost taunting. "I know everything about you, Dot." I felt a wave of fear wash over me. I didn't recognize the voice, but there was something disturbingly familiar about the way they spoke, as if they had known me for a long time, longer than I was comfortable with. I was about to hang up when the voice spoke again, this time more insistent. "I know what you did, Dot." My heart skipped a beat. I had no idea what they were talking about, but the way they said it, the certainty, the confidence made my stomach churn. I gripped the phone tighter, my mind racing. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Stop calling me." I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the nightstand, my hands trembling. My heart was pounding so hard that I could hear it in my ears. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm myself down. It had to be a prank. Someone had gotten my number, probably through social media, and decided to mess with me. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again. It was another call from unknown caller. I didn't answer it this time. I let it ring until it stopped, my hands shaking as I stared at the screen. I wanted to believe it was just a prank, but something about the way they had spoken, so calm, so certain, left me rattled. And then a text message came through. "You can't ignore me, Sarah." My stomach twisted with fear. My mind raced, trying to figure out who this could be, how they knew my name, and what they wanted from me. Another message buzzed onto the screen. "I know what you're hiding, Dot." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. What was this? What was happening? I hadn't done anything. I had no idea what this person was talking about. I blocked the number, hoping that would be the end of it. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. For the next few nights, I didn't receive any more calls or messages. I started to relax, convincing myself that it had all been some kind of sick joke. But just as I was starting to put it out of my mind, the calls began again. This time, they came every night, always after midnight, always from unknown caller. I never answered them, but each time, they left a voicemail. The messages were always the same. "I know what you did, Sarah. You can't hide from M.E. I'm coming for you. I went to the police, but there wasn't much they could do. The number was untraceable, and without any real threats, they couldn't take action. I tried changing my number, but the calls continued, always from unknown caller, always after midnight. Then, one night, I received a voicemail that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just the voice on the other end anymore. It was a recording of me. I listened in horror as the sound of my own voice echoed through the phone, distorted but unmistakable. It was a conversation I had had earlier that day, an argument with a friend about something trivial, but there was no way anyone could have known about it. I hadn't recorded it, and I hadn't spoken to anyone else about it. Someone had been listening. I felt a wave of panic surge through me. Whoever this was, they weren't just messing with me. They were watching me, listening to me, and now they were taunting me with it. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, pacing around the apartment, checking every window, every door, making sure they were locked. But no matter how many times I checked, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching, waiting. The next night, the call came again. This time, I answered. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling with fear. "What do you want from me?" There was silence on the other end for a few seconds, followed by the familiar sound of static. And then, the voice spoke again. "It's too late, Sarah. I felt my heart stop. "I'm already here. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I scanned the room, my eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. The apartment was silent, but I could feel that something was wrong. Then I heard it. A soft creak, like the sound of a door slowly opening. It was coming from the hallway. My blood ran cold as I realized what was happening. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed 911, but before I could hit the call button, the voice on the other end spoke again. "You can't run from E.E. The line went dead. I stumbled out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest as I rushed toward the hallway. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the glow of my phone screen. I moved slowly, my breath coming in short, panic gasps as I approached the hallway door. I reached out, my hand trembling as I pushed the door open. And there, standing in the doorway, was a figure. I couldn't see their face, couldn't make out any details. Just a silhouette, tall and unmoving, standing in the shadows, watching me. I backed away, my heart racing, my mind screaming at me to run. But before I could move, the figure stepped forward, their voice barely a whisper. "I told you, I'm already here.